Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Historian. Tonight, as the world around you becomes quieter and the demands of the day begin to loosen their hold, we are going to travel into a room where history was written one slow movement at a time. There are no battlefields here, no royal processions, no cheering crowds, no dramatic speeches echoing through enormous halls. Instead, there is a table, a quiet room, a sheet of parchment, a small container of ink, and a person sitting patiently in front of them, preparing to write. Before we begin, make yourself comfortable. Adjust your blanket if you need to. Let your shoulders soften. Allow your breathing to settle naturally. There is nowhere you need to hurry tonight. You do not need to remember every name or date. You do not need to follow every detail. You can simply listen. And if you enjoy these slow journeys into the quieter corners of history, consider liking the video and subscribing to Sleepy Historian. You can always return another evening when you want to step away from the modern world and spend some time somewhere much slower. Tonight we are going somewhere especially quiet. We are going to sit beside the people who made medieval books, the scribes. When most of us imagine a medieval manuscript, we tend to see the finished object. Perhaps you imagine an old book resting behind glass in a museum. Its parchment has survived hundreds of years. Its letters remain carefully arranged across the page. Some pages may contain elaborate decorations. There may be painted figures, bright colors, intricate borders, perhaps even thin traces of gold catching the light. The finished manuscript can look almost impossibly beautiful, and because it looks so calm, it is easy to forget something. The book was not created calmly. Not entirely. Behind every beautiful page was a considerable amount of physical work. Before a single sentence could be copied, the writing surface had to be prepared. Parchment had to be produced from animal skin. The skin had to be cleaned, stretched, scraped, dried, and prepared for writing. Sheets had to be cut and arranged. Lines might be ruled across the surface. Quills had to be selected and shaped. Ink had to be prepared and kept usable. Another manuscript, known as an exemplar, had to be available if the scribe was copying an existing text. Only after all of this could the actual writing begin, and then the work became wonderfully simple. One letter, then another, one word, then another, one line, then another, for hours, perhaps for days, sometimes for months. The finished page hides all of this. That is the quiet mystery we are going to explore tonight, because when you look at an old manuscript, you are looking at the result. You are not seeing the tired hand that created it. You are not hearing the quill moving across the parchment. You are not feeling the stiffness that gradually settles into the shoulders. You are not watching the scribe pause to sharpen the quill. You are not seeing the moment when a mistake appears and has to be corrected. You are simply looking at the finished page. And the finished page is beautiful. The work behind it is almost invisible. So tonight we are going to make that invisible work visible again. Imagine yourself entering a medieval writing room before the day's work has properly begun. The room is cool. The light is limited. Perhaps a narrow window allows a little gray daylight to enter. Perhaps candles or lamps provide additional light when necessary. The air carries the faint smell of parchment, wood, and ink. There are no electric lights, no computer screens, no printer waiting beside the desk, no keyboard, no convenient way to copy an entire page with a few movements of your fingers. Everything must be done by hand. You sit down. In front of you is a piece of parchment. It is not perfectly uniform. The surface has its own character. Perhaps there is a slight variation in texture. Perhaps a faint mark remains from the animal from which it was made. You learn to work with the material rather than expecting the material to behave perfectly for you. Beside the parchment lies your quill. But a feather is not automatically a writing instrument. It has to be prepared. The end must be cut carefully. The tip must be shaped. The opening must allow ink to flow properly. Too much ink, and the writing may spread. Too little, and the line may become faint. The quill itself will change as you work. Its tip will gradually wear. The movement of your hand will change. Eventually you may need to stop and sharpen it again. This is not an interruption in the work. It is simply part of the work. The same is true of the ink. It must be prepared. It must remain usable. It must flow across the writing surface without becoming too difficult to control. Everything depends upon small physical details. And then, finally, you begin. The first stroke is made, then another. You look at the exemplar. You look back at your own page. Another letter. Another word. Another line. The room remains quiet. Outside, the medieval world continues. People are waking. Animals are being fed. Bread is being prepared. Doors are opening. Tools are being carried into workshops. Farmers are beginning another day in the fields. But inside this room, time feels different. Your world has become the size of the page in front of you. The work requires concentration, not dramatic concentration, not the kind that belongs to moments of danger. Something quieter, a steady attention, the kind that must survive repetition. Because writing one beautiful line is not the great challenge, writing another line after it is, and another, and another. Eventually the hand begins to feel different. At first you hardly notice. Your fingers are comfortable. Your back is comfortable. The page seems almost empty. There is plenty of work ahead, but there is also plenty of time. Then the hours begin to accumulate. Your shoulders become aware of the position in which you have been sitting. Your fingers begin to feel the repeated movement. Your eyes move constantly between the exemplar and your own page. You adjust your posture. Perhaps you pause briefly. Then you begin again. One stroke, another, another. This is where the popular image of the peaceful medieval scribe becomes incomplete. Yes, the room may have been quiet. Yes, the work could be meaningful. Yes, manuscripts could preserve knowledge for generations. But quiet work can still be tiring work. The scribe was not simply preserving beautiful objects. The scribe was performing a skilled occupation, and like many occupations, it depended upon patience, accuracy, practice, endurance. A mistake mattered. A missing word could matter. A line copied incorrectly could change meaning. A damaged page could create additional difficulty, and yet mistakes happened. Human beings made them. Medieval manuscripts sometimes preserve evidence of these moments. Corrections, scraped areas, added letters, changed words, small marks left behind by people who were trying to get the page right. These imperfections are easy to overlook, but they are also strangely comforting, because they remind us that the person behind the manuscript was not a machine. There was a human hand holding the quill, a human eye following the text, a human mind trying to remember where the previous line ended, a human person becoming tired, and sometimes a human person making a mistake. That person may have left no biography behind. We may never know where they were born. We may never know what they looked like. We may never know what they thought about the text they copied. But their handwriting remains. Centuries later, their movements are still visible. Their hands are gone. Their voices are gone. Their daily lives are gone. Yet something remains. A line of ink, a page of parchment, a correction in the margin, a tiny irregularity that tells us someone was sitting there. And perhaps this is what makes the forgotten work of medieval scribes so fascinating. They created things that often outlived them by centuries. The manuscript survived. The scribe did not. The words survived. The hours spent copying them disappeared. The parchment survived. The tired hands that held it became part of history. Tonight we are going to stay close to those hands. We will begin before the writing starts. We will prepare the room. We will examine the materials. We will watch the quill being shaped. We will consider the parchment beneath the hand. We will follow the slow movement of ink across the page. And as the hours pass, we will discover what it actually meant to spend a working day copying words in a medieval world. But the work of the scribe was not limited to simply making letters. There was preparation before writing. There was correction after writing. There were pages to organize. There were manuscripts to maintain. There were texts to compare. There were sometimes decorations to add. There were books to assemble and eventually bind. A manuscript was the product of many stages, and behind those stages could be several different kinds of skilled workers. Some manuscripts were created in religious communities, others were produced in workshops, some were made for wealthy patrons, some were copied for practical use, some contained religious texts, others preserved literature, history, law, medicine, or other forms of knowledge. The medieval book was not one single thing. It belonged to many different worlds. But every one of those worlds depended upon human hands. That is what we will return to throughout tonight's journey. Hands, eyes, ink, parchment, time, and patience. So for a moment, let everything else become distant. The modern world can wait. The lights can remain dim. The noise outside can fade. Imagine instead that you are sitting at the writing table. The parchment is beneath your hand. The ink waits beside you. The quill is ready. Somewhere beyond the walls, another medieval day is beginning. You take a slow breath. You look at the first line. And then, very carefully, you begin. One stroke, then another. The first word appears. The book has not yet become beautiful. It has only begun. And over the long hours ahead, we will discover just how much patience, skill, and ordinary human labor could disappear inside a single medieval page. So settle in, let your thoughts become quiet, and welcome to the forgotten work of the medieval scribe. The working day does not begin with writing. That is one of the first things you notice. You have come to the room expecting perhaps to sit down, dip a quill into ink, and begin copying words. But the parchment is not quite ready. The quill is not quite ready. Even the light has not yet settled into a condition that makes careful writing comfortable. So you wait. Not because there is nothing to do. Because there is already work to do before the work begins. The room is cool. If you are imagining a monastery, it is tempting to picture a warm chamber lit beautifully by candles, with golden light falling across a clean wooden desk. But most ordinary working spaces were much less theatrical. Light was valuable. Fuel was valuable. Space was practical. And the comfort of the person doing the writing was not necessarily the central concern. You sit close to the work surface. The wood beneath your arms is hard. The parchment in front of you is pale, but it is not the perfectly uniform white that modern paper can provide. Its surface carries subtle variations. One area may be smoother than another. Somewhere there may be a faint mark left from the animal from which it came. You look at it before you begin. That is part of the job. A scribe cannot simply assume that every surface will behave in exactly the same way. The parchment has already passed through several stages of preparation before reaching you. Animal skin has been cleaned, soaked, stretched, scraped, dried, and treated until it becomes a writing material. The work has taken time, and the finished sheet still remembers something of its origin. There may be a slight curve, a difference in thickness, a small scar, a place where the surface feels almost imperceptibly rough beneath the fingers. None of these things necessarily prevents writing, but they are things you learn to notice. You run your hand lightly across the surface. Then you look at the lines. A page intended for careful copying usually needs some kind of ruling. The writing must have somewhere to go. Without guidance, the lines could gradually drift downward or become uneven. So the page is prepared. Measurements matter. Margins matter. Spacing matters. The finished manuscript may make this look effortless. A reader centuries later sees neat rows of letters marching calmly across the page. But before those rows existed, someone had to establish where they would sit. You make your measurements. You mark the page. You prepare the writing area. The work is quiet enough that small sounds become noticeable. The faint scrape of a tool, the movement of parchment, the soft knock of something placed on the desk. Perhaps another scribe is working nearby. You hear a chair move. Then the room becomes quiet again. You return your attention to your own page. There is something almost hypnotic about these preparations. Nothing dramatic happens. The page is simply becoming ready. And while it becomes ready, time passes. The morning light slowly strengthens. If the weather is overcast, the room may remain dim. If it is winter, the cold may remain for much longer than you would like. You notice your fingers. They are not necessarily painful. Not yet. But they are cool. You rub them together briefly. Then you begin preparing the quill. The feather has to become an instrument. A feather by itself cannot give you the controlled marks you need. You hold it carefully. The shaft is light. The material feels delicate, but the end must be shaped with precision. A small knife is used to cut away the unwanted portion and form the nib. The cut matters. Too broad and the writing may become too thick, too narrow, and the quill may not behave properly. The angle matters. The pressure matters. The way the quill meets the parchment matters. You trim it. Then you look at the point. Perhaps it needs another adjustment. You make another small cut. The task takes only a moment. But if you are going to spend hours writing, that moment matters. A poorly prepared quill will make the entire session more difficult. So you prepare it properly. The same feather will not remain perfect forever. As the hours pass, the tip can wear. Ink may not flow as cleanly. The width of the stroke can change. The scribe becomes accustomed to this. The quill is not an invisible tool. It is part of the work. You may keep more than one nearby. A spare feather can be useful. Another tool may be waiting on the desk. The knife remains close because the writing instrument is something that may need attention throughout the day. Then there is the ink. You look toward the small container. The ink is dark. It seems simple enough. But the darkness on the page is the final result of a material that has had to be prepared and kept usable. You dip the quill carefully, not too deeply. You do not want excess liquid gathering around the nib. You bring it toward the parchment. And then, before making the first proper line, you test it. Perhaps on a scrap. Perhaps somewhere that will not interfere with the finished page. You watch how the ink moves. The first stroke is always a small experiment. Does it flow? Does it spread? Does it catch? Does the parchment absorb it in the way you expect? The surface answers quietly. You adjust. Then you look toward the manuscript you are copying. This is another part of the process that modern readers can easily forget. You are not composing freely. The words already exist somewhere else. Your task is to reproduce them. That means your attention moves constantly between two places. The exemplar. Your page. The exemplar. Your page. You read a small portion. You remember it. You lower your eyes. You write it. Then you look back. The movement becomes familiar, almost automatic. But it cannot become completely automatic. That would be dangerous, because the moment your attention slips too far, the words can become confused. A line can be skipped. A phrase can be repeated. A letter can be mistaken for another. You must remain attentive while performing an action that is inherently repetitive. That is one of the peculiar burdens of the scribe. The work is monotonous enough to make the mind wander, yet the work is precise enough that wandering can create mistakes. So you settle into a narrow middle ground. Your body repeats. Your eyes move. Your mind follows. The room remains quiet. A little more daylight enters. You begin to understand that the day will be measured differently here. There may be no reason to think in minutes. You think in pages, in lines, in sections. In the gradual darkening of the ink on the parchment, perhaps there is a bell somewhere in the larger community, marking a religious hour or another part of the daily routine. But while you are sitting at the desk, your immediate world is smaller. The page is the measure. You look at the top. There is still much empty space. That can be discouraging if you think about the entire manuscript. So you do not think about the entire manuscript. You think about the next line. This is important. A manuscript can be enormous. Hundreds of pages may eventually exist. The thought of copying all of them at once would be exhausting. Instead, the work is reduced to something manageable. One page, one section, one line, one word. The first line is still waiting. You place the quill down. You look at the exemplar. You return to the parchment. Your hand settles into position. The room seems to grow quieter. You make the first stroke, then another. The ink leaves a narrow dark mark. The page is changed, only slightly, almost invisibly. But it is changed. A few letters now exist where there was blank parchment a moment before. You continue. The first line takes shape, and perhaps this is the moment when the romantic image of the medieval scribe becomes slightly more complicated, because the beautiful manuscript has begun. But the beautiful manuscript is still a long way away. There will be corrections. There will be interruptions. There will be worn quills. There will be tired hands. There will be changes in light. There will be pages that seem to take forever. There will be mornings when the room is colder than you would like. There will be afternoons when the same postures become difficult to ignore. And through all of it, the work will remain remarkably simple. Look, copy, look again, copy again. The simplicity is what makes it demanding. You do not need to imagine an extraordinary hardship. You only need to imagine doing one small, precise thing for a very long time. The hand moves. The eyes follow. The ink grows older on the page. Outside, the medieval day continues. Inside, the manuscript slowly comes into existence. And for now, you are still near the beginning. There is plenty of parchment ahead. Plenty of ink. Plenty of lines. You sharpen the quill once more in your imagination. You settle your hand, and the next line waits quietly beneath the first. The page in front of you looks quiet. That is probably the first impression. It lies flat beneath your hand, pale in the low light, waiting for another line of writing. But if you stop and think about it, the page is not really an empty surface at all. It is the result of work that happened long before you sat down. You are not writing on paper. You are writing on something that has been made from an animal skin. And that difference matters. Today, when you need another sheet of paper, you probably do not think about where it came from. A clean page can be produced in enormous quantities. It can be cut to standard sizes, stacked evenly, transported in bundles, and replaced without much thought. The medieval scribe could not treat parchment in quite the same way. Each sheet had already required labor. Someone had to obtain the hide. It had to be prepared. It had to be cleaned. It had to be soaked and stretched. Hair and unwanted material had to be removed. The skin had to be scraped repeatedly while it was held under tension. Then it had to be dried and prepared until it became suitable for writing. The result could be remarkably fine. But it was still an organic material. It did not behave like a manufactured sheet of modern paper. You can feel this when you place your hand against it. There is a slight resistance beneath the fingertips. The surface may be smooth, but not perfectly uniform. You move your hand across it. Near one edge, the texture changes. Another part may feel thinner. Somewhere there may be a faint scar. It does not necessarily interfere with the writing, but it reminds you that the page has a history. Before the ink, there was the animal. Before the writing desk, there was the skin. Before the manuscript, there was a long chain of practical work, and you are only one person at the end of that chain. The parchment has already traveled through several hands. You do not need to know all of their names. Most likely you do not. You simply receive the material and learn how to use it. This is one of the quiet realities of medieval craftsmanship. A finished object can hide the number of people required to make it possible. A manuscript appears to belong to the scribe, but the scribe is working with a material that someone else has already transformed. You turn the sheet slightly. Perhaps the surface catches the light. The color is not completely uniform. Some parchment is creamy, some is more yellow, some has darker areas. The differences are part of the material, and because parchment is valuable, you cannot treat it casually. Every available space matters. This does not mean that every medieval manuscript was produced with exactly the same level of economy, or that every scrap was saved forever. But the material was certainly more consequential than the disposable paper you might use today. A mistake was not simply a mistake in the words. It could also be a problem on an expensive writing surface, so you look carefully before you begin. Perhaps the sheet has already been ruled. Perhaps the gatherings have already been organized. The pages are not simply loose rectangles waiting to become a book. They must eventually belong to a larger structure. This is where the physical architecture of a manuscript begins to matter. A sheet can be folded. Several folded sheets can be arranged together. These groups of folded leaves form gatherings, sometimes called quires. The exact arrangements vary across periods in manuscripts, but the basic idea is simple. The pages must remain in order. The beginning must eventually connect to the next section. The writing must stay within the intended structure. A scribe therefore works inside an object that is being assembled gradually. The page beneath your hand is part of something larger. You cannot see the whole thing yet. You may not even know exactly how the finished volume will look, but the decisions being made now will eventually affect the final book. You touch the edge of the parchment. It may curl slightly. You flatten it. The room is still cold. This becomes more noticeable because the material itself is cool beneath your hand. You move your fingers. Then you return to the quill. There is a particular intimacy to writing on parchment. The page is close to the body. Your wrist rests near it. Your fingertips sometimes touch it. The sound of the quill moving across the surface is faint. It is not the smooth, scratching sound people sometimes imagine. The quality changes according to the parchment. Some areas accept the ink beautifully. Other areas may be less cooperative. You learn to adapt. That is one of the things a skilled scribe has to do. Skill is not simply the ability to reproduce letters. It is the ability to respond to material. The page gives you information. You feel how the quill moves. You see how the ink behaves. You notice whether the stroke is spreading. You adjust your pressure. You change the angle of the quill. The adjustment may be so small that an observer would never notice it. But after hundreds or thousands of lines, these tiny adjustments become part of your working habit. You are learning the page as you write on it. This makes the idea of medieval handwriting slightly different from the modern idea of handwriting. Today you might think of handwriting as the visual expression of an individual, a signature, a personal style, a particular way of forming letters. For the medieval scribe, handwriting was certainly individual in some respects, but it was also trained. Different scripts were developed for different purposes and periods. Letter forms were taught. Proportions mattered. Spacing mattered. Consistency mattered. The hand had to be disciplined. You could not simply decide that one letter would become enormous because you felt like writing it that way. The manuscript demanded a certain visual order, and that order had to be maintained across page after page. The parchment did not make this easier. Its imperfections remained. You may reach an area where the quill behaves differently. The line feels slightly less smooth. You slow down, a tiny adjustment, then another. The writing continues. This is the kind of labor that disappears completely when we look at a finished manuscript. The page seems stable. The letters seem to have always been there. But while the scribe was creating them, nothing was stable. The hand moved. The quill changed. The ink changed. The light changed. The body changed. Even the writing surface could demand adjustment. And still the line had to remain orderly. You continue copying. The exemplar is nearby. Your eyes move toward it. You read a few words. Then you return to the parchment. The first letters appear. You are not rushing. There is no reason to rush. Rushing would only make mistakes more likely. The work depends on patience, and patience in this environment is not necessarily a pleasant feeling. Sometimes patience simply means continuing while nothing particularly interesting is happening. The page does not reward you immediately. It grows slowly. One line may take only a little time, but hundreds of lines create a day. Thousands create a manuscript. The scale of the task can therefore become strange. Imagine looking at a completed volume. Perhaps it is thick. Perhaps the pages are decorated. Perhaps the binding is impressive. You might admire it for a few minutes. But the person who produced the text had to encounter every one of those lines separately. They could not see the completed book while they were making it. They saw only the small portion in front of them. That is another reason the work could become repetitive. The future manuscript exists mainly in the imagination. The present consists of a page, then another. You lower your eyes. The room seems warmer now, though perhaps it is only because you have become accustomed to the cold. Your fingers are moving more confidently. The quill is behaving well. The ink is flowing. The parchment is holding the letters. For a while everything works. This is a good moment, not an exciting one, simply a moment when the materials cooperate. The scribe does not need excitement. The scribe needs the page to behave, and when it does, the work can become almost meditative. The hand moves, the eye follows, the page fills, the same shapes appear again and again. Letters, spaces, words, punctuation marks, abbreviations. The visual rhythm becomes familiar. Outside, time continues. Inside, the page changes. There may be sounds from elsewhere in the building. Footsteps, a door, a voice. Perhaps another worker moves nearby. But your attention returns to the parchment. You have learned something about it now. You know where the surface is smooth. You know where the quill needs more care. You know how much pressure the page can take. This is knowledge that never appears in a written instruction. It is practical knowledge, the kind learned through repetition, the kind stored in the hand. And that is perhaps the most important thing to understand about parchment. It was not simply a surface. It was part of the craft. The scribe had to negotiate with it. The material had its own limitations. It could be damaged. It could resist. It could show traces of earlier preparation. And yet, when everything went well, it could preserve writing for centuries. That durability is one reason we can sit quietly today and encounter words written hundreds of years ago. The page survived, the ink survived, the marks remained, but the long process that produced them has mostly disappeared. The hands are gone, the room is gone, the cold morning is gone. The particular piece of parchment that once rested beneath someone's wrist has become an artifact. We can examine it now under modern light. We can photograph it. We can turn its pages carefully. We can admire the letters. But we cannot feel the exact resistance that the original scribe felt beneath the quill. We cannot know exactly how cold that particular morning was. We cannot hear the small sounds of that particular room. We can only approach them through the traces that remain. And so you return to the page. The parchment is still beneath your hand. The ink is still wet. The work is still unfinished. There is no reason to think about centuries from now. That world does not exist for you yet. There is only the next line. You look toward the exemplar. You look down again. Your quill touches the parchment. Another letter appears. Then another. The page slowly fills, and beneath your hand something that once belonged to a living animal is becoming a surface for words that may outlive you. You do not know that. You simply keep writing. Anna, parchment before writing, cinematic historical realism, oil paint realism, a medieval scribe examining a carefully prepared sheet of parchment with both hands before writing, visible natural variations in the animal skin, subtle scars and uneven texture, rough wooden desk, stone scriptorium interior, dark ink vessel, feather quills and small knife nearby, dusk or early morning atmosphere, soft firelight illumination, faint smoke and praquert realist karker, your polite prank. Hiwart Mykovkut. The quill has become familiar now. It rests between your fingers almost as naturally as any ordinary tool might. But it is worth remembering that it did not begin its life as a writing instrument. It began as a feather, something light enough to be carried by a bird, something made for movement to the air. And now it has been cut, shaped, trimmed, and held in your hand because a medieval manuscript depends upon it. You look down at the narrow shaft. The feather itself may still be partly attached. It gives the tool a softness that seems almost out of place beside the dark ink and pale parchment. But the important part is the tip. The nib. That small section is where the feather meets the page. Everything depends on it. If the cut is wrong, the writing changes. If the point becomes too blunt, the line becomes heavy. If the quill is too flexible, The stroke may not behave as expected. If it becomes damaged, you must stop. So the quill is never completely separate from the writing. It is part of the writing. You hold the knife again. The blade is small. You do not need to do much. A little shaving here, a small adjustment there. The work requires care because you are shaping something that is itself quite delicate. The feather has already been selected for a reason. Some feathers are more suitable than others. The strongest flight feathers are particularly useful because they have the right combination of strength and flexibility. Once prepared, the quill can be held comfortably between the fingers. You test it. The tip touches the parchment. You make a short stroke. The ink moves. You lift the quill. There is a small amount of ink left on the page. You inspect the mark. It is acceptable. So you continue. At first, the movement of the hand is relatively easy. Your fingers are fresh. Your wrist is relaxed. The page is still close to the beginning. You have not yet spent hours repeating the same movement. This is the easiest part. The difficult part will arrive gradually. That is often how repetitive work behaves. Nothing terrible happens. Nothing dramatic changes. The body simply accumulates the experience of doing the same thing. The fingers hold the quill. The wrist guides it. The hand moves in small controlled motions. The forearm remains near the desk. The shoulder stays in approximately the same position. The eyes move between the exemplar and the page. Again, and again, and again, and again. The repetition is so complete that you may begin to stop noticing individual letters. You start to notice shapes, patterns, the rhythm of the script. This is useful. It allows you to work more efficiently, but it also creates a particular kind of mental fatigue. The words become familiar. The movement becomes familiar. The page becomes familiar. And because everything is familiar, the mind can begin to drift. Yet the work does not allow complete drifting. A scribe cannot simply let the hand move while the mind wanders somewhere else. The text has to remain accurate, so your attention moves in a narrow circle. You read, you remember, you write, you check. You read again, you write again. The process becomes a rhythm. Perhaps you can imagine the sound. Not loud. Just the small repeated movement of a quill across parchment. There is a faint scratching, then silence as you lift it. Another scratch, another pause. The sound changes when the quill moves across a slightly different part of the page. You begin another line. The ink gathers at the tip. You write. Then you notice that the line has become faint. You need more ink. This is another tiny interruption. You dip the quill, lift it, allow excess ink to settle. Return to the page. The interruption lasts only moments. But over the course of a day, there can be many such moments. The finished manuscript does not record them. It does not show you every time the scribe stopped to replenish the quill. It does not show every time the tip needed sharpening. It does not show every moment when the ink behaved differently. All of those actions have vanished. Only the letters remain. And perhaps that is one of the strangest things about manuscript history. The final object preserves the result, but not the rhythm. You can see the lines. You cannot see how long each line took. You can see the writing. You cannot hear the breathing of the person who made it. You can examine the ink. You cannot watch it gather on the tip of the quill. You can study the hand. You cannot see the hand becoming tired. So tonight, we stay with the hand. The hand is important, because writing is often imagined as something the mind does. You know what you want to say. You know what the letters mean. You know the language. But the medieval scribe's body still has to perform every mark. The mind cannot simply command a page to become full. The body must make it happen. And the body has limits. Your fingers begin to notice the work. Perhaps there is a slight tension where the quill rests against them. You loosen your grip. Then, after a while, you tighten it again. Too loose and the quill may move unpredictably. Too tight and the fingers become uncomfortable. There is a balance. A practiced scribe learns it. The hand develops habits. The wrist learns how much movement is required. The fingers learn how to guide the nib. The eye learns how much space a letter should occupy. The process becomes embodied. You are not thinking consciously about every movement. If you did, the work would become unbearably slow. Instead, your body remembers. This is one reason trained handwriting can look so consistent. The consistency is not effortless. It is the result of practice. The hand has been taught what to do, and then it has been asked to do it again, and again, and again. The page begins to fill. The first line is no longer alone. There are several lines now. You can see the writing becoming a block. The empty parchment is shrinking. The manuscript is beginning to look like a manuscript. This can give you a small sense of progress. Not excitement. Just confirmation. You have done something. The page is no longer blank, but you still have much farther to go. You dip the quill again. The ink is dark. For a moment, the writing is particularly smooth. The nib glides. The letters appear evenly. This is satisfying in a quiet way. Then the stroke catches slightly. You pause. Perhaps the tip has begun to wear. You inspect it. Nothing serious. Still usable. You continue. This is how much of the occupation may have felt. Not one long, uninterrupted flow. Rather, a collection of tiny adjustments. You sharpen the quill. You check the ink. You straighten the parchment. You shift your body. You look toward the exemplar. You continue. The work consists partly of writing and partly of maintaining the conditions that allow writing to continue. That is true of many crafts. The finished object makes the supporting actions invisible. A person looking at a medieval manuscript might imagine the scribe writing continuously for hours. But no one can write continuously in exactly the same way. There are always small pauses, small preparations, small corrections, small moments of looking. The work is made from these fragments. You might pause to sharpen the quill. The knife scrapes gently against the tip. A few tiny pieces of feather or material fall away. You inspect the point, then you return to the page. Perhaps another scribe nearby is doing the same thing. For a moment you hear the quiet scraping of another knife. Then it stops. The room becomes quiet again. You continue copying. There is something almost musical about this repetition. Not music in the usual sense, a rhythm made from practical sounds. Quill, page, pause, quill, page, pause, ink, page, another line. The day is passing without asking you to notice it. Light changes slightly. The stone walls remain cool. The fire, if there is one nearby, gives off a gentle warmth that does not reach every part of the room. Your hands continue. This is where the scribe's work becomes less romantic. There is nothing especially beautiful about sitting in one position for a long time. The manuscript may eventually be beautiful. The act of making it is often ordinary. You sit, you hold, you look, you repeat. The body does not become heroic simply because the finished book is important. It becomes tired, and tiredness is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is only the moment when you notice that your fingers are no longer as comfortable as they were an hour ago. You rotate your wrist slightly. You move your shoulder. You take a breath. Then you return to the line. There is still work to do. The manuscript does not care whether your hand feels fresh. The next line remains empty, so you fill it. The quill moves again, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the page becomes dense with writing. The ink darkens the parchment. The margins remain. The lines remain orderly. Your hand keeps the rhythm. You look at the exemplar. You look down. You look back. There is no need to hurry. In fact, hurrying is precisely what you are trying to avoid. Accuracy is more important. One careless moment can create a mistake that requires even more time to repair, so you proceed carefully. The quill touches the page. The ink leaves another letter, then another. Your hand is now fully involved. It has become part of the manuscript's creation. Long after you are gone, Someone may look at those letters and notice the distinctive shape of the script. They may identify the hand. They may compare it with other pages. They may study the way the letters were formed. But they will be studying the trace of a physical process. The hand itself will be absent. Only its habits remain: the slight pressure, the consistent spacing, the shape of a curve, the way one letter joins another. These things survive. The person does not, and for now, the hand is still there, still warm, still holding the quill, still making the next line. You dip the tip once more, you bring it down. The parchment accepts the ink. Another line begins. The first page is no longer empty. That small fact begins to matter. At the beginning, the parchment seemed almost too large for the task. The blank surface suggested an enormous amount of work. But once the first lines were written, the page became something more manageable. There is writing now. A block of letters, a few margins, a beginning. You do not need to think about the entire manuscript. You only need to continue. The exemplar lies beside you. You look at it. Your eyes move across a small group of words. Then they return to your own page. You begin copying. The first few letters come naturally. Your hand already knows the movement. You do not need to think about every curve. You simply form it, then another, then another. The line grows. The work is slow enough that the words seem almost to appear one at a time. You reach the end of the line. You pause. The quill lifts from the parchment. Your eyes return to the exemplar. You find your place. Then you begin again. This is the basic rhythm. It is simple. It is also the rhythm that will occupy much of the day. Read, remember, write, check, read again, write again. You might imagine that copying an existing text would be easier than creating something original. In one sense, it is. The words are already there. The scribe does not have to decide what to say, but copying brings its own demands. The text must be followed carefully. A scribe can understand the meaning perfectly and still make an error. The eyes can jump from one line to another. A familiar phrase can tempt the hand to move too quickly. A repeated word can disappear from attention. The mind can recognize the pattern and assume what comes next. And that assumption can be wrong. So you keep returning to the exemplar. Your eyes move. Your hand follows. The work becomes a kind of conversation between two pages. One page tells you what should exist. The other is becoming it. The distance between them must remain small. You read a few words. You hold them briefly in your mind. You lower your eyes. You write. Then you look back. Sometimes the amount you can hold comfortably may be quite small. That does not matter. You simply repeat the process. The room around you continues to exist, but it becomes less important. The stone wall is there. The wooden beams are there. Other workers may be nearby, but your attention has narrowed. The manuscript occupies most of your immediate world. This narrowing can feel peaceful. It can also be tiring, because there is very little variation. The same movement continues. Your eyes make the same journey. Your hand makes similar shapes. The page fills at almost exactly the pace you can manage. You cannot make it fill much faster without risking mistakes. So the manuscript grows slowly. This is one of the strangest things about hand copying. The importance of the final object has no effect on the speed at which each letter can be made. A magnificent book still begins as one letter. A large manuscript still requires one line at a time. The scale of the finished work is hidden from the hand doing the work. You cannot write 50 pages at once. You can only write the next one. And perhaps that is why the work can become strangely hypnotic. The mind is relieved of the need to imagine the entire task. It focuses on the next small unit, the next word, the next line, the next section. You continue. The ink is dark enough. The parchment is smooth. The quill moves well. For a while everything is comfortable. Then your attention shifts. You hear something, perhaps a footstep, perhaps a quiet conversation somewhere farther away. Your eyes remain on the page. You continue writing. The sound fades. The line continues. You reach the end. You stop. Look back. Find your place. Begin again. Hours can be made from moments like this. That is difficult to appreciate when looking at a finished manuscript. The completed page gives no indication of how repetitive its creation was. The letters are arranged so neatly that the work almost disappears. This is especially true when the scribe is skilled. A practiced hand can produce writing with remarkable consistency. That consistency is useful. It makes the page easier to read. It also makes the labor less visible. The better the work appears, the easier it is to forget that a person had to produce it. You continue. Your posture remains nearly the same. Your left hand may steady the parchment. Your right hand guides the quill. Your eyes move constantly. The position seems comfortable enough for the moment. But there is another kind of effort involved here. Attention. The body is not the only thing working. Your mind must remain close to the text. You cannot simply copy the shapes without understanding where you are in the sequence. Even when the text is familiar, the scribe needs to know where the present line ends and the next begins. The exemplar may contain abbreviations. Some letters may resemble one another. The script may be compact. The page may have its own visual density. Your eyes have to interpret it quickly. Then your hand has to reproduce what they have seen. It is a quiet coordination. Eyes, memory, hand, parchment, ink. Again and again. The longer you work, the more natural the movement becomes. But natural does not mean effortless. Think of any movement performed repeatedly. At first you notice every action. Later you stop noticing the action itself. But your body continues doing the work. This is what happens here. The quill moves almost without conscious instruction. Your hand forms letters from learned patterns. Your eyes find familiar shapes. Your attention remains just close enough to catch mistakes. The rhythm settles, and once it settles, time becomes difficult to measure. Perhaps the light has changed. You notice that only because you glance toward the window. The morning brightness is different now. The room may have become warmer, or perhaps it is not. You are not entirely sure. The manuscript is a better clock than the sky. A few lines have become a paragraph. The paragraph has become part of a page. The page is beginning to look full. You pause. You may stretch your fingers. Not for long. There is still work waiting. You look toward the exemplar. You find the next passage, and continue. Sometimes the scribe may have worked from a text that was itself a copy. That means an error could already exist in the source. This creates another quiet problem. The person copying the text is not always simply transferring perfect information. They are working within a tradition of copying. One manuscript may have been produced from another. That earlier manuscript may have contained errors. Let your shoulders settle. Another scribe may notice them and correct them, or may introduce a new error while trying to fix an old one. The manuscript, therefore, has a history that reaches backward. The page in front of you may contain words that have already passed through several pairs of hands. You do not necessarily know who those people were. You simply have the exemplar. You trust it as far as you can. And then you copy. The process is not entirely mechanical. A scribe may have to make judgments. A difficult letter may require interpretation. A damaged area may be uncertain. A missing word may have to be inferred. But much of the time the task is simpler. Look, copy, check, continue. There is something restful about that simplicity. The world outside may contain arguments, weather, illness, trade, travel, religious obligations, political uncertainty. Inside the scriptorium, for this stretch of time, there is only the page. You do not need to solve the world. You need to complete the line. You dip the quill again. The tip touches the parchment. The movement begins. One letter, then another. The words are already known. You simply bring them across. The manuscript grows, slowly, so slowly, that if you watched it for a minute, you might think nothing had happened. Watch for an hour, and the difference becomes clear. That is the scale of the work. progress is almost invisible while it happens. Only afterward can you see it. A full page where there was once a blank surface, a gathering where there was once loose parchment, a completed section where there was once only an exemplar. This is why repetition matters. Repetition is not merely a feature of the work, it is how the work becomes possible. The scribe cannot rely on moments of inspiration. The manuscript is built from ordinary actions. The hand moves, the eyes read, the ink dries, the page fills. The page fills. The process repeats. You continue through another line, then another. Perhaps you make a small pause at the margin. Your hand shifts. The parchment moves slightly. You straighten it. You look at the exemplar again. The next passage is waiting. There is no dramatic change. And there does not need to be. The work is happening. That is enough. The day continues to pass. The page continues to fill. And somewhere in the quiet room, another person may be doing exactly the same thing. Another quill, another parchment sheet, another sequence of letters, another pair of eyes moving between source and copy. Many small acts occurring at once, none of them spectacular. Together they produce books, and those books will eventually travel far beyond this room. Some may be read by generations of people. Some may be stored away. Some may be lost. Some may survive for centuries. But right now, none of that is visible. You are simply a person sitting at a desk. You have an unfinished line in front of you, so you look back at the exemplar. Find your place, lower your eyes, and write. At first, you do not notice your hand. This is probably how it should be. The work is still new enough that the movement feels natural. The quill rests between your fingers. The parchment lies beneath your wrist, and your attention remains on the text. You read, you copy, you check, you continue. The hand is simply doing what it has been trained to do, but time has a way of making ordinary things noticeable. After enough lines, you become aware of the pressure between your fingers. It is not pain, not yet, just pressure. The quill has been held in almost the same position for a long time. You loosen your grip. For a few moments, the hand feels better. Then the writing requires another adjustment, and your fingers settle back into their familiar position. This is the beginning of a very ordinary problem. The body is not designed to remain completely still while performing tiny movements indefinitely. A scribe needs stability. The page cannot move too much. The quill cannot wander. The letters must remain consistent. So much of the body becomes quietly fixed. Your shoulder stays near one position. Your elbow rests close to the desk. Your wrist remains controlled. Your fingers perform the smaller movements. The rest of you becomes almost like a support structure for the hand. You may not think about it at first, but after an hour the posture has become something you feel. You shift slightly. The wooden seat is hard. The desk does not move with you. You adjust your back. You roll one shoulder. Then you look down again. The next line is waiting. There is nothing unusual about this. That is precisely the point. The discomfort of the medieval scribe was often not dramatic. It was the ordinary discomfort of having a body and needing to make that body perform a repetitive task for a long time. You sit. You write. You remain seated. The page grows. Your body slowly becomes aware of itself. Perhaps the neck is stiff. Perhaps the shoulders feel slightly heavy. Perhaps one finger has become more noticeable than the others. You move it. Then you return to the quill. The work continues. It is tempting to imagine that medieval people were somehow more accustomed to physical hardship than modern people. In some ways, they certainly lived with conditions that would be unfamiliar to us, but that does not mean their bodies stopped becoming tired. A person accustomed to cold still feels cold. A person accustomed to hard wooden furniture still develops a sore back. A person accustomed to manual work still notices a hand after hours of repetition. Familiarity does not remove sensation. It simply changes the way you respond to it. You learn when to move. You learn when to pause. You learn how to hold the tool. You learn which posture allows you to continue. This is practical knowledge. It is not necessarily written down. It becomes part of the craft. You can imagine a more experienced scribe watching someone younger. Perhaps the younger person grips the quill too tightly. The older scribe might notice. A small adjustment. A quiet instruction. Relax the hand. Change the angle. Sit differently. Do not press so hard. These tiny lessons can make a long day more manageable. Because the work does not require great strength, it requires controlled endurance. That is a different kind of physical demand. You are not lifting something heavy. You are not running. You are not struggling against a violent force. You are simply asking the same small muscles to perform precise movements over and over. That can become surprisingly tiring. The fingers are constantly involved. The wrist is constantly adjusting. The forearm remains engaged. The shoulder provides stability. The neck stays inclined toward the page. The eyes remain focused. The whole posture participates, and the longer the session lasts, the more you begin to notice that posture. You shift again. Perhaps you straighten your back. The movement feels good. For a moment. Then you bend forward, because the page is easier to see from that position. The comfort does not last. You settle back into the work. This is how time passes, not in large events, in tiny adjustments, a hand moving, a shoulder relaxing, a neck turning, a back straightening, then the same posture returning. The scribe's desk itself matters. A writing surface must be high enough and positioned correctly for the task. Different settings and periods use different arrangements. Some scribes may have worked at desks designed specifically for writing. Others may have had less specialized furniture. The exact experience varied, but wherever the work happened, the physical relationship between person and page mattered. You needed to see the writing. You needed to control the quill. You needed the parchment to remain stable. You needed enough light, and you needed to continue. The phrase continue becomes important, because there is always another line. The manuscript is rarely finished simply because your hand has become tired. The work has a larger rhythm. Perhaps there are established working hours. Perhaps the scribe's day is divided by religious services, meals, or other obligations. Perhaps the person works for a particular period and then stops. But within each working period, the basic demand remains. Keep writing. You look at the page. The letters are still neat. That matters. Even if your shoulders are beginning to feel heavy, the writing must not become careless. This creates a quiet tension. Your body wants to relax. The page requires control. You negotiate between the two. Perhaps you pause. You put down the quill. Your hand opens. The fingers straighten. You flex them gently. The movement is small. You look at the page while doing it. Then you pick up the quill again. The interruption has lasted perhaps only a few moments, but it has changed your awareness. Now you notice the hand more clearly. You feel the pressure of the quill. You become aware of the wrist. You are conscious of the desk beneath your forearm, and then, gradually, the awareness fades. The work becomes familiar again. Read. Copy. Check. Continue. This alternation between awareness and forgetting may have been part of the rhythm of long scribble work. You notice the body. Then you stop noticing it. You notice the cold. Then you stop noticing it. You notice the light. Then you stop noticing it. The mind adapts. That does not mean the physical conditions disappear. They simply become background. This is perhaps one reason long repetitive occupations can seem almost invisible when viewed from the outside. An observer sees a person sitting quietly. The observer might think the person is comfortable, but comfort and stillness are not the same thing. A still body can be working very hard to remain still. You feel this after sitting for a long time. The muscles that hold your posture are not completely relaxed. They are quietly active. And when the task requires precision, you cannot simply lean anywhere. You must remain in relation to the page. The head moves toward the text. The hand remains close to the writing line. The wrist must be steady. The eyes must remain within a manageable distance. The whole body becomes organized around the manuscript. There is something almost intimate about this. The book occupies your physical space. You lean toward it. Your hand touches it. Your eyes move over it. Your breath passes above it. The page becomes the center of your small world. And while the page remains still, you are the thing that gradually becomes tired. The manuscript does not become tired. The parchment does not complain. The ink does not need to stretch. The page simply waits. You are the one who must continue. You look at the next line. Your fingers are a little stiff. You adjust the quill. The nib touches the parchment. Another letter appears, then another. You keep going. Perhaps you think about the end of the day's work. It is still far away, so you stop thinking about it. There is no advantage in imagining how many lines remain. The number would only make the task feel larger. Instead, you focus on the small area immediately in front of you. One line, one phrase, one letter. This is how long work becomes manageable. You reduce the future to the next movement. Your hand continues. The room remains quiet. Somewhere beyond the scriptorium, people are moving through their own routines. There may be bells, there may be footsteps, there may be voices. But inside your immediate world, the rhythm is unchanged. Quill, parchment, ink, pause, quill again. The tiredness is not an event, it is a layer. It settles gradually over the body. At first you barely notice it. Then you notice your fingers, then your wrist, then your shoulders, then your shoulders, then your back. But none of these sensations is strong enough to stop the work. So you adapt, you shift, you stretch, you continue. This is endurance in its quietest form, not overcoming some enormous obstacle, simply remaining at the task. The manuscript advances because the scribe remains there. Without the person, nothing happens. The page remains blank. With the person, one line becomes another. The work is almost absurdly dependent on the continued presence of one tired human being, and yet that is how so many manuscripts came into existence, not through one extraordinary effort, through thousands of ordinary moments. A hand picking up a quill, a hand putting it down, a finger being stretched, a shoulder being moved, a page being straightened, a line being copied, a mistake being noticed, another line being started. The repetition continues. The body changes slowly. The page changes slowly. Both are moving through time. Only one of them will remain. Eventually, the scribe will leave the desk. The hand will stop. The ink will dry. The room will become empty. But the page will remain. And perhaps someone centuries later will look at those lines without imagining the tired hand that made them. For now, though, the hand is still there. You flex your fingers once. You breathe quietly. You look at the next line. And you begin again. The line you are writing looks correct. At least you think it does. You continue for a little longer. Then something feels wrong. You stop. The quill lifts from the parchment. Your eyes move back across the line. There it is. A missing word. Or perhaps not. You look again at the exemplar. Your eyes move along the passage, then back to your own page. You have skipped something. It is a small mistake. Only a word, perhaps a short phrase, but the page is already covered with ink, and this is where copying a manuscript becomes different from writing on a modern screen. There is no easy way to place the cursor behind the missing word. You cannot simply press a key and make the sentence rearrange itself. The parchment is still there, the ink is still there. The mistake has become physical. You look at it for a moment. The rest of the page is correct. The missing word stands out now that you have found it. You need to decide how to deal with it. Sometimes a correction can be made in the margin. Sometimes a word can be inserted between lines. Sometimes the existing ink can be removed or altered. The exact method depends on the manuscript, the period, the material, and the nature of the mistake. But whatever method you use, the basic problem remains. You have already written the wrong thing. The page remembers. This is one of the quiet burdens of scribal work. Accuracy is required, but perfection is not guaranteed. The scribe is a human being. The eyes can jump, the mind can anticipate, the hand can move too quickly. A familiar phrase can become almost invisible to attention. And when the text is long enough, mistakes become possible simply because there are so many opportunities to make them. You look toward the exemplar again. Then back to the page. You consider the correction. If the mistake is minor, perhaps a small mark will be enough. If a letter has been omitted, perhaps it can be inserted. If a larger section is wrong, the problem becomes more complicated. You might need to scrape the ink away. This requires another tool. The knife. You pick it up. The blade is not being used for cutting parchment now. It is being used carefully against the writing surface. You do not want to damage the page. You need to remove the ink while preserving the material underneath. The movement is delicate. A little scraping, then a pause. You inspect the surface. Again. A little more. The correction leaves a trace. Even when the mistake disappears visually, the surface may remember that something happened there. A tiny roughness, a slight change in texture. Perhaps the corrected area absorbs ink differently. Perhaps it becomes visible under certain light. The page has acquired a history. The mistake is no longer part of the text, but it has become part of the manuscript. This is one reason old manuscripts can be fascinating to examine closely. They are not always as perfect as they appear from a distance. The letters may be beautifully formed, the pages may look orderly, but if you examine them carefully, you may find signs of correction. A word inserted, a letter altered, a line scraped, a margin filled with a note. These are traces of the person at work. The mistake makes the human being visible. You continue reading. Perhaps you are relieved that the correction worked. You return to the line. The quill touches the parchment again. Now you are more careful. For a while the writing slows. Your eyes remain especially attentive. The next phrase is copied, then another. The error becomes a memory. You continue. Eventually, the rhythm returns. Look, write, check, write, check, write. But the possibility of another mistake remains. That is part of the background pressure. The work does not become dangerous. Nothing dramatic is about to happen. But you know that the page cannot simply be taken for granted. Every line needs attention. This is particularly true when the text becomes repetitive. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity creates expectation. And expectation can be dangerous for a copyist. You see the beginning of a familiar phrase. Your mind knows what usually comes next. Your hand begins moving before your eyes have fully confirmed the words. The error can happen in that small gap. A word disappears. A phrase is repeated. A line is skipped. The scribe may not notice immediately. Sometimes the mistake is discovered several lines later. Then the correction becomes more inconvenient. You look back. Where did the error begin? You trace the writing. The answer is somewhere behind you. Perhaps you must compare the manuscript carefully. Perhaps another person checks the work. Perhaps you notice it yourself during rereading. Whatever the circumstances, the mistake adds time. That matters, because time is already being spent slowly. A page that takes hours cannot afford endless corrections. So accuracy is valuable not only because the text should be correct. It is valuable because mistakes create additional labor. The medieval scribe is therefore working under a quiet economy of effort. Every line requires time. Every correction requires more. Every damaged quill creates a pause. Every poorly prepared page can cause difficulty. The work is built from small costs. You continue. The room is quiet. The ink is drying. The corrected area is now almost invisible. You look at the page again. It seems orderly. Perhaps no future reader will notice what happened, but you will remember it, at least for a while. You know where the mistake was. You know that the line nearly went wrong. Then the memory fades. Another page begins. Another sequence of words. The human mind returns to its rhythm. This is important because scribes were not simply copying mechanically. They were reading. They were interpreting letters. They were understanding sequences. They were watching the physical material. They were controlling their hands. They were monitoring their own work. The occupation required several forms of attention at once. It could become exhausting, yet the work remained quiet. That contrast is worth lingering over. A person can be deeply occupied without appearing busy. From across the room you might see a scribe sitting almost motionless. Nothing dramatic is happening, but the person's eyes are moving constantly. The hand is making hundreds of tiny decisions. The mind is comparing two texts. The body is maintaining a controlled posture. The ink must be monitored. The page must be protected. The work may look peaceful. It is peaceful in some ways, but it is not empty. There is concentration inside the stillness. You reach the end of another line. This time it is correct. You continue. The next line is correct. Then another. Your confidence returns. The page fills. The mistake becomes part of the distant background, but it may not be the last one. A long manuscript gives you many opportunities. Even experienced scribes make mistakes. The existence of corrections in surviving manuscripts tells us this clearly. People copied, checked, corrected, and sometimes left traces of their uncertainty. Those traces are valuable to historians now. A modern reader might see a scraped area and think only of damage, but the mark can also tell a story. Someone noticed something. Someone stopped. Someone changed it. Someone decided the page should say something else. The manuscript is therefore not only a record of a text, it can also be a record of decisions. Small decisions, quiet decisions, decisions made by tired people sitting in rooms that have long since disappeared. You look down at the page. There is another correction in the margin. Perhaps it was made earlier. Perhaps it was made by another hand. The manuscript has become a conversation across time. One scribe writes. Another corrects. A later reader adds something. Someone else may remove or change it. The page accumulates layers. But your task remains simpler. You must continue copying. You straighten the parchment. You dip the quill. You check the exemplar. Then you begin the next line. The pressure of accuracy returns. Not strongly, just enough. You watch each word. You make each letter carefully. The line advances. There is no need to hurry. You have learned that speed can be expensive. A faster line is not necessarily a better line. A careless movement can create several minutes of additional work. So you let the hand move at its natural pace. The letters appear. The ink darkens. The page fills. And gradually you begin to forget the earlier mistake. This is another quiet feature of long work. Small problems appear. They occupy your attention. Then they are resolved. Then the work absorbs them. The day continues. The manuscript continues. The body continues. Nothing has been solved permanently. There is only the next line. And as you begin it, the earlier correction becomes just another small mark in the history of the page. Centuries from now, perhaps someone will notice it. Perhaps they will wonder why the surface is slightly different there. Perhaps they will identify what happened. Perhaps they will not. But you were there when the mistake was made. You were there when the knife touched the parchment. You were there when the corrected line was written again. And then you moved on. Because that is what the work requires. Not perfection, continuation. The page does not tell you what time it is. You have been writing for a while now, but the manuscript offers no clock. There are only the lines, the changing light, the occasional sound from somewhere beyond the room, and the gradual awareness that your body has been sitting in one position for longer than you first realized. You look toward the window. The morning has changed. Perhaps the light has become stronger. Perhaps clouds have moved across the sky and the room is almost as dim as it was earlier. In a medieval writing room, light is not something you simply switch on. It arrives. It changes. It disappears. And the scribe has to work within those changes. This is one of the quiet differences between your world and the world of the medieval manuscript. You may be listening to this in a room where a single movement can brighten everything. A lamp can be turned on. A screen can illuminate an entire desk. You can continue reading at midnight almost as easily as at noon. The medieval scribe does not have that freedom. The day has a physical brightness, and when the brightness fades, the work becomes more difficult. So you notice the window. The light is shifted slightly across the floor. It touches the edge of the desk. The parchment looks different. Earlier the page was illuminated mostly from one direction. Now the light has moved. The change is subtle. You adjust the position of the manuscript. Perhaps you turn the page slightly. Perhaps you move your chair. The work continues. You have already learned that the page must be treated carefully. Now you are reminded that the room itself has to be negotiated. Light matters. Temperature matters. The materials matter. The body matters. Everything is connected. A scribe needs enough light to distinguish small letter forms. That may sound obvious, but when the writing is compact, a small reduction in visibility can matter. The lines are close together. Letters may be similar. Abbreviations may be unfamiliar to a modern eye. The ink may not always be perfectly dark. The parchment may not be perfectly even. So the scribe needs to see clearly. During the brighter parts of the day, natural light does much of the work. Windows can provide illumination, although the size and quality of windows vary greatly by building and period. The room may still be relatively dim. Stone walls do not glow. A narrow opening does not turn a chamber into a modern office. There may be shadows. There may be corners where the page becomes harder to read. You become accustomed to the available light. You position the parchment where it can be seen. You lean slightly closer. Your eyes work. For a while you barely notice. Then the light shifts again. The day is moving. You are moving with it. Outside the sun is continued along its path. Inside the manuscript remains in front of you. You write another line. The ink is dark. The page is pale. The contrast helps. You continue. But there is another condition you cannot ignore. Cold. Medieval interiors could be cold, particularly during winter. Stone buildings are excellent at holding the temperature of their surroundings. A room may have a fire, but a fire does not necessarily warm every corner. You can sit close to warmth and still have cold hands. That matters for a scribe. The fingers are the instruments of the work. They need to remain controlled. Cold makes everything feel slightly more difficult. You notice this when you first begin. The fingers may feel stiff. The joints may seem slower. The quill feels colder. The parchment feels cool beneath the hand. You rub your fingers together. Then you return to the page. The body gradually adjusts. Perhaps the fire has warmed the immediate area. Perhaps you simply stop thinking about the cold. But it remains there. A quiet condition, not an emergency, not an extraordinary hardship, just cold, the kind of cold that makes you aware of your hands. You look at the flame. It moves gently. The fire produces a small amount of warmth. It also produces smoke. The smoke rises. The room smells faintly of burning fuel. The light from the fire is warmer than the daylight, but you cannot rely on firelight in the same way you rely on modern electric light. A candle or lamp can help, but artificial light in the medieval world has its own limitations. It costs something. Fuel has to be obtained. Flames need attention. Light can flicker. Shadows move. The conditions are never entirely neutral. The scribe works inside them. You return to the parchment. The quill moves. The page fills. Perhaps you notice that the letters are slightly less comfortable to see than they were earlier. You blink. You lean closer. You pause, then you continue. This is another form of endurance. Not endurance against a single great hardship. Endurance against conditions that are mildly inconvenient for a very long time. Cold, dimness, stiffness, limited space, repetitive movement. None of these has to become severe to affect the day's work. Together, they create the atmosphere of the occupation. The room asks something of you. You answer by continuing. The light shifts again. Now the window is brighter. The stone floor looks different. The page is easier to see. You may feel slightly more awake, or perhaps you are simply more accustomed to the work. You look at the manuscript. Another section has been completed. The sense of progress is small, but it is there. You turn the page. The new sheet is clean. For a moment the blank parchment feels almost bright. You prepare it. You check the ruling. You find the next passage in the exemplar. Then the familiar rhythm begins again. Read. Copy. Check. The new page seems to promise a fresh start. But the work is the same. Your hand is not fresh. Your eyes have already been working. Your shoulders have already been sitting in the same posture. The day is already advanced. The new page simply gives you another surface. You begin. One line, then another. The sound of the quill is soft. Outside, perhaps someone passes. You hear footsteps, then nothing. The room settles again. There may be several scribes working nearby. Each one has a small pool of light. Each one is facing a page. Each one is dealing with the same basic limitations. The room may feel almost motionless. But the day is not motionless. The light keeps changing. The temperature shifts. The fire burns lower. The shadows move across the wall. A scribe can measure time without looking at a clock. The body knows. The light knows. The routine knows. Perhaps there is a bell. Perhaps there is a meal. Perhaps there is a religious service that interrupts the working period. These larger markers divide the day, but between them are long stretches that feel almost identical. This is where the hours begin to blur. You write. You pause. You look toward the window. You return to the page. The light has changed again. You barely remember when it changed. The work has absorbed your attention. There is something almost gentle about this repetition. It can be tiring, but it can also narrow the mind. The outside world becomes distant. You no longer need to think about the entire day. You simply follow the page, the next line, the next word, the next letter. Your hand knows the movements. Your eyes know the route. You have done this many times already, and you will do it many more times. The cold becomes background. The sounds become background. Even the light becomes background. The manuscript remains in front of you. This is how an ordinary working environment becomes a rhythm. The conditions do not have to be comfortable. They only have to become familiar enough that you can continue. You pause again. Your fingers are cool. You bring them closer to the warmth for a moment. Perhaps you rub them gently. The fire gives a little heat. Then you return. The parchment waits. You dip the quill. The ink gathers at the tip. You place it against the page. The first letter appears, then another. The line grows. The light is still sufficient, so you continue. Eventually, the day will become darker. The window will stop providing useful light. The fire and lamps will become more important. The work may slow. Perhaps you will stop altogether. But that moment has not arrived yet. For now, there is enough light, enough warmth, enough ink, enough parchment, and so you remain. The scribe's world is made from these small sufficiencies, not abundance, just enough. Enough light to see, enough heat to keep working, enough ink to continue, enough parchment to complete the next section, enough strength in the fingers, enough attention to avoid another mistake, enough patience to sit through another hour. The manuscript grows because all of these conditions happen to hold together. And when one becomes difficult, the scribe adjusts. The chair is uncomfortable. You shift. The light is changing. You move the page. The fingers are cold. You warm them. The quill is wearing down. You sharpen it. The body is wearing down. You pause briefly. Then you continue. Nothing about this is spectacular. And yet, over months and years, these small adjustments produce objects that can survive for centuries. The room grows quieter. The fire gives another small crack. The light on the parchment is soft. Your hand moves across the page. Another line appears. You look toward the window one last time. The day is already further along than you expected. Then you return your eyes to the manuscript. There is still enough light, so you keep writing. The page in front of you is only one part of the work. The writing has begun, but before a scribe can spend hours filling parchment with letters, a great deal has already happened. The page had to exist. The ink had to exist. The quill had to be prepared. The writing surface had to be made suitable. Even the desk had to be ready. None of these things appears in the finished manuscript. You see the writing. You do not see everything that made the writing possible. So for a little while, you leave the completed lines behind and think about the materials themselves. The parchment beneath your hand is not simply paper. It has its own history, its own texture, its own imperfections. It began as an animal hide that had to be processed, cleaned, stretched, dried, and prepared before it could become a writing surface. The process required time. It required skilled labor, and it required a material that was valuable enough to justify all that preparation. You run your fingers lightly over the page. It feels smooth, but not perfectly smooth. There may be small differences in texture, a slight variation in thickness. Perhaps a faint mark remains from the material's earlier life. The surface has been prepared carefully. Still, it is organic. It does not behave like something manufactured to absolute uniformity. You notice this when the quill moves. The nib glides easily across one area, then catches slightly in another. You adjust the pressure. Continue. The parchment accepts the ink. The page has become part of the writing process. A scribe must learn its behavior. That is another quiet form of knowledge. You learn which areas feel different. You learn how much pressure the quill can take. You learn how the ink behaves on the surface. You learn that not every page is identical. This matters because the finished manuscript can make the material look almost anonymous. Once the lines are complete, the parchment becomes a background. The words seem to be the important part, but for the person writing them, the surface is constantly present. The hand feels it. The eyes see it. The quill responds to it. The page is not passive. It has qualities that affect the work. You turn the sheet slightly. The light catches the surface. For a moment you can see its texture more clearly. Then you return to the writing. The material has already required enormous effort before reaching this desk. Somewhere earlier in the chain of work, people prepared hides. They removed unwanted material. They washed and treated the surface. They stretched it. They allowed it to dry. They worked it again. The exact processes varied by region and period, but the basic reality remains. A writing surface had to be made before it could be written upon. And that means the history of the manuscript begins before the scribe picks up the quill. You might think of the manuscript as beginning with the first letter, but physically its beginning lies much earlier. The parchment comes first, then preparation, then ruling, then writing, then correction, then perhaps decoration, then binding, then storage. A book is a chain of tasks. The scribe sits somewhere in the middle of that chain, and while you write, you may not be thinking about any of it. You are simply trying to complete the next page. The parchment beneath you may have been folded, cut, and arranged according to the intended structure of the book. The pages are not necessarily treated as isolated pieces. They belong to a larger organization. Groups of sheets can be gathered together. The manuscript begins to acquire its physical architecture, but the scribe encounters it one page at a time. This is another curious feature of the work. You know that the book will eventually have many pages, but your immediate responsibility remains small. One sheet, one column, one line. The larger object exists mostly in your imagination. You continue writing. The ink is another material with its own story. It is dark. It flows. It dries. But it had to be prepared. Different recipes and materials were used across medieval Europe and other manuscript cultures. One familiar kind of medieval writing ink was made using substances such as tannins and iron salts, producing a dark liquid capable of bonding with the writing surface. The exact recipe could vary, so could the quality. The ink had to be suitable for the work. Too thin, and the letters might appear weak. Too thick, and the quill might not behave properly. Too much ink on the nib could create an unwanted blot. Too little could produce a faint line. So you learn the ink, you watch it, you dip the quill, you lift it, you allow the excess to settle. Then you write. The movement becomes familiar, but the ink remains unpredictable enough that you must pay attention. Perhaps the mixture has thickened. Perhaps the tip is carrying too much. You adjust. This is not an extraordinary problem. It is simply another part of the occupation. The finished manuscript hides it. The dark letters appear stable, but they began as wet marks. They had to be transferred from a container to the page. Then they had to dry. The transformation is simple. Liquid becomes writing. You watch the nib. A small amount of ink remains. You continue. There is something satisfying about the physical clarity of the process. The page begins pale. The quill arrives. Darkness appears. The line grows. Then the ink settles. The page is changed. You can see exactly where your hand has been. A blank surface becomes a record of movement. This is perhaps one of the few moments when the passage of time becomes visible. The longer you work, the more of the page belongs to you. Not ownership, presence. Your movements remain. Every letter is a trace. Every word records where the quill traveled. The hand disappears. The line remains. You continue. The desk itself is another unnoticed object. A writing desk does not need to be beautiful. It needs to be useful. It needs to support the page. It needs to allow the scribe to work. The wood may be worn. Perhaps the surface has scratches. Perhaps there are small stains. Perhaps the edge has become smoother from repeated use. You rest your arm against it. The wood is solid, unyielding. After several hours you become aware of that solidity. The desk does not adapt to your body. You adapt it to the desk. You shift slightly, then return to your work. Around you are other materials, knives, quills, ink vessels, parchment sheets, perhaps a ruler, perhaps a small container, perhaps scraps left from preparation. The working area has its own order. A scribe needs to know where things are. The knife should be available. The ink should be within reach. The exemplar should remain close enough to read. The parchment should not be disturbed unnecessarily. The work becomes easier when the tools are arranged sensibly. Again, this is not dramatic. It is simply the practical intelligence of a workplace. You learn how to arrange your small world, and then you use it. The manuscript itself may also require ruling. Lines have to be established before writing begins, especially when a formal and orderly page is intended. These lines guide the hand. They provide boundaries. They help keep the text aligned. You may barely notice them once the writing is complete, but they have already influenced every line you have written. Your letters sit within a structure. The margins remain relatively consistent. The columns maintain their shape. The page looks orderly because someone created that order. Sometimes the marks may be faint. Sometimes they are more obvious. But they are there. You follow them. The ruling becomes another silent guide. You do not need to think about it constantly. Your hand simply stays within the boundaries. That is another example of how much of the scribe's work depends on preparation. The more carefully the page has been prepared, the easier it is for the writing to appear controlled. You are not starting with chaos. You are starting with a surface that has been organized for you. And still your hand must do the rest. You continue. A little more ink. Another line. The quill scratches gently. The sound is almost comforting now. You have heard it for so long that it has become part of the room. The fire makes another quiet sound. Someone shifts nearby. Then the room settles again. Your attention returns to the page. Perhaps the parchment is beginning to feel warm beneath your hand. Perhaps the air remains cold. The contrast is small. You continue anyway. The material world of the scribe is very close. Nothing is distant. The page is under your fingers. The quill is between them. The ink is a few inches away. The knife is beside the desk. The exemplar is within reach. The fire is somewhere nearby. The stone wall surrounds you. There is no separation between the work and the materials. You are inside them. This is different from imagining writing as a purely intellectual activity. The medieval manuscript is physical from beginning to end. The words may carry ideas. The ideas may survive for centuries, but the ideas have to pass through materials: skin, wood, ink, feather, metal, wax, thread, glue. Every part matters. You write another line. The quill begins to feel slightly less smooth. You inspect the nib. Perhaps it needs attention. You put the quill down. The knife comes into your hand again. A few careful movements. You reshape the tip. You test it. The nib touches a scrap, a short line. Good enough. You return to the manuscript. This tiny interruption has taken only a little time, but there are many such interruptions in a long working day. They are part of the rhythm. The manuscript does not grow continuously. It grows in between maintenance. You prepare. You write. You stop. You repair. You stop. You repair. You write again. The page records only the writing. The rest disappears. This is why the finished book can feel strangely complete. All the uncertainty has been hidden. All the preparation has been hidden. All the waiting has been hidden. What remains is a sequence of confident-looking letters, but behind those letters is a chain of ordinary decisions. How much ink? How much pressure? Where should the page sit? Is the light sufficient? Does the quill need sharpening? Is the parchment behaving well? Have you copied the line correctly? Should you pause? Should you continue? The scribe answers these questions constantly. Most are answered without words. The body learns. The craft becomes routine, and routine is what allows the manuscript to grow. You look at the page again. The material beneath the writing has almost disappeared from your awareness. You are seeing the words now, but your fingers still feel the parchment. The quill is still in your hand. The ink is still wet in places. The desk is still beneath your arm. The physical world remains. You continue copying. Another letter, another word, another line. The manuscript grows from materials that were once scattered across different parts of the world of medieval labor. An animal hide became a writing surface. A feather became a pen. A prepared substance became ink. Wood became a desk. Metal became a knife. Threads and other materials will eventually help turn separate sheets into a bound volume. None of these objects began as a book. The book emerges only when they are brought together, and the scribe is one of the people who brings them together, quietly, repeatedly, one page at a time. The room is growing darker now. The firelight touches the edge of the parchment. You can see the completed lines. The page feels substantial in your hands. You turn it slightly, then return to the next section. There is still work to do. The materials are ready. The quill is ready. The ink is ready. And for another little while, so are you. By now, the work has acquired its own rhythm. You no longer need to think about where the ink is kept. You know where the quills are. You know which knife belongs on the desk. You know where the exemplar should rest. The page is prepared. The lines are ready. And so you begin again. There is something almost strange about how little seems to happen. You sit. You read. You write. You pause. Then you write again. Outside the scriptorium, the day continues to change. Inside, the manuscript changes much more slowly. A few inches of parchment may represent an hour of work. A single page may represent a substantial portion of a day, and a complete manuscript may require weeks, months, or even much longer, depending on its size, complexity, decoration, and the number of people involved. You do not experience that entire span at once. You experience the present page. That is all. The next line is waiting. You lower the quill. The ink touches parchment. Another letter. Another. The movement has become familiar enough that your attention begins to soften around the edges. You still need to remain alert, but you are no longer consciously thinking about every movement. The hand has learned. The eye has learned. The body has settled into the occupation. There is a quiet efficiency now. The quill moves. The line grows. You reach the end. Pause. Look at the exemplar. Find your place. Begin again. This cycle can continue for a remarkably long time. And because it is so repetitive, small things become important. A sound, a change in light, the feeling of cold air moving through the room, the warmth of the fire, the slight movement of another person. These details divide the hours. You hear a footstep. Someone passes behind you. You do not look up. The footsteps fade. You continue writing. A little later there is a quiet sound from the fire. You glance toward it. A piece of wood has shifted. The flame rises briefly, then settles. You return to the page. The manuscript has not changed much during those few moments, but you have been reminded that time is moving. The work can make time feel unusually flat. One line resembles the next. One page resembles the next. The same tools remain beside you. The same walls surround you. The same hand performs the same small movements. This sameness is not necessarily unpleasant. In fact, it may be one of the things that allows the work to continue. Once the routine is established, you do not have to make many new decisions. The body knows what comes next. The mind can remain close to the text without having to constantly reinvent the process. You read, you copy, you check, you continue. There is a kind of quiet economy in that, but sameness can also make the hours difficult to measure. You may think you have been working for a short while. Then you notice the light. It has changed considerably. You look toward the window. The sky outside is no longer as bright. You realize that more time has passed than you expected. Perhaps you stretch your neck. You move your shoulder. The small movement feels good. Then you settle again. There is still enough light. You continue. The scribe's working day is not necessarily one uninterrupted block. Medieval daily life was structured by many kinds of time. Meals, religious observances, bells, household duties, seasonal changes. The particular institution where a scribe worked would shape the rhythm. A monastic scribe might live within a schedule strongly influenced by the religious life of the community. A professional or lay scribe working in another setting could have a different routine. There was no single medieval schedule. But there was one constant. The work had to fit inside the available day, and the available day was shaped by the sun. This makes the changing light more important. In winter, the useful hours of daylight are fewer. In summer, there are more. The length of the day changes the practical possibilities of work. You might begin when the light is sufficient. You might stop when it becomes difficult to see. Artificial illumination can extend the working period, but it cannot erase the difference between day and night. So the manuscript lives partly inside the calendar. The same desk feels different in winter than in summer. The same page is easier to see at one hour than another. The same hands feel warmer in one season and colder in another. The occupation is repetitive, the conditions are not. You continue. The quill makes another quiet sound. You reach the margin. The line is complete. You inspect it, no mistake. Good. You move to the next line. The small satisfaction is barely noticeable, but it matters. A correct line requires no correction. That means you can move forward. The page continues to fill. You may begin to develop a sense of how much writing remains in the current section, not because you are counting every letter, because your eye has learned the proportions of the page. You know where the end of the passage is likely to fall. You know roughly how much parchment remains. The manuscript becomes familiar as an object. You begin to recognize its physical shape. The pages already completed feel different from those still waiting. There is a growing thickness beneath your hand. The book is becoming heavier. That change is gradual. At first, perhaps, it was barely noticeable. Now there are enough completed pages that the manuscript has substance. The work has accumulated physically. You can lift it. You can feel it. The hours have become weight. That is one of the few ways the passage of time becomes tangible. A manuscript grows heavier because you have been sitting there. You have written. The pages have multiplied. The book now contains the physical evidence of all those hours. But you are not finished. You turn another page. The new surface waits. There is something almost severe about a blank page. It asks for work without saying anything. You look at it, then at the exemplar, then back at the page. The next section begins. You prepare the quill. Ink, touch, letter. The blank surface starts to disappear. This is perhaps the most basic rhythm of the scribe's life. Blankness becoming writing, again and again. A page begins empty, then a first line, then another. Then the margins become defined. Then the page is full, then it is turned, and the next blank page appears. The cycle repeats. You can imagine doing this hundreds of times, not necessarily in one sitting, across weeks, across months, perhaps with interruptions, perhaps with changes in weather, perhaps with periods when other responsibilities take priority. But eventually, the pages accumulate, the manuscript grows, and the scribe remains at the center of the process. You continue. Your body has now become very familiar with the desk. You know exactly how far you need to lean. You know the comfortable position of the wrist. You know how much ink the quill can hold. You know when the nib begins to feel less reliable. You know the slight movement that straightens your back. This knowledge is not theoretical. It is practical. It comes from repetition. You have learned the occupation by doing it. That kind of knowledge can be difficult to preserve in written instructions. A book could explain how to prepare a quill. It could describe a suitable ink. It could show examples of script. But it cannot completely explain how a tired wrist should feel. It cannot tell you precisely when to loosen your fingers. It cannot replace the experience of seeing a line become too faint. These things are learned through the body. The craft lives partly in the hands. And perhaps that is why the handwriting of an experienced scribe can look so different from the handwriting of someone who is still learning. The experienced hand has settled. The movements are economical. There is less unnecessary motion. The letters become consistent. The page looks calm. But beneath that calm appearance is a great deal of repetition. You have done this before, many times. You will do it again. The work becomes less about discovering how to write and more about sustaining the ability to write. That distinction matters. Learning a skill can be difficult. Maintaining it for hours can be a different kind of difficulty. You already know how to form the letters. The challenge is continuing to form them accurately when your fingers are tired, your back is stiff, and the light is changing. The manuscript demands steadiness. You provide it, not perfectly, but well enough. The room becomes quieter as the day moves on. Perhaps some of the other workers have stopped. Perhaps the room is not as full as it was earlier. You notice the absence of small sounds. The silence seems larger. You continue alone for a while. The fire is lower. The light is softer. The parchment seems brighter against the darkening room. Your hand moves. The ink catches the light. Another line. Another. There is no urgency. You do not need to finish the entire book tonight. You only need to finish what the day's work allows. That is an important difference. The manuscript is larger than the person. It has its own time scale. The scribe contributes a little. Then another scribe may contribute something else. A decorator may work later. A binder may eventually assemble the pages. A reader may open the completed book years afterward. The object moves through time by passing from one person's hands to another. You are only one stage, and yet without your stage the words do not reach the next. You look at the page. There are several lines left. Before the section ends, you continue. The first line, the second, a pause, the third. Your hand is beginning to feel heavy again. You flex your fingers. The movement is almost automatic. Then you resume. The hours between pages are made from this, not from major events, from small continuations. A page is completed. Another begins. A quill is sharpened. A little ink is added. A hand is stretched. A line is checked. A mistake is corrected. The fire burns lower. The light changes. The page fills. The body tires. The work continues. Eventually, you may begin to lose track of which page you are on. The manuscript has become too familiar. You know only that there are still pages ahead. The future has no urgency. It simply exists. Another blank surface. Another sequence of lines. Another period of quiet work. And for tonight that is enough. You do not need to imagine the completed book. You only need to watch the next line appear. The quill touches parchment. The ink spreads gently. The hand moves from left to right. The line grows. The room remains still. Outside, the day is becoming evening. Inside, the manuscript becomes a little larger, and the work continues in the same quiet way it began. One page after another. 1 hour after another. One hand returning to the same task. The manuscript may look like the work of one person, one hand, one style of writing, one continuous movement across the parchment. But a medieval book was often less solitary than it appears. Even when a single scribe copied most of the text, other people could be involved in the process. Someone prepared materials. Someone might have ruled the pages. Someone could check the text. Someone might add decoration. Someone else might eventually bind the completed sheets. And sometimes more than one scribe worked on the same manuscript. So the quiet room you are sitting in is not necessarily occupied by one person alone. There may be several desks, several pages, several hands, several kinds of work happening at once. You look up briefly. Another scribe is sitting not far away. Their posture is similar to yours, head lowered. One hand steadying the parchment, the other holding a quill. There is no conversation, or perhaps there is a little. A quiet exchange, a short question, then silence again. The work does not require constant communication. Each person has their own page, their own exemplar, their own rhythm. And yet the room has a shared atmosphere. The sound of several quills moving across parchment is different from the sound of one. It is still quiet, but the silence has texture. A scratch here, a scratch here, a scratch here, a pause there, the small movement of a chair, a cough, the turning of a page. Then the sound of writing returns. You lower your eyes. Your own line is unfinished. So you continue. This is one of the less visible aspects of manuscript production. The book may carry the name of an author. It may preserve the words of a theologian, historian, poet, scholar, or ancient writer. But the person whose hand physically placed those words onto the page may be someone else entirely. The scribe is often not the author. That distinction seems obvious now. But it is easy to forget when looking at a beautiful manuscript. The written words can make the scribe disappear. You see the ideas. You see the language. You may admire the handwriting. But the person who copied it remains somewhere behind the page. And perhaps there were several such people. Imagine the manuscript lying open before you. The first section may have been copied by one hand. Later, another hand takes over. The difference might be subtle. Perhaps the letters become slightly taller. Perhaps the spacing changes. Perhaps certain abbreviations are used differently. A modern reader might not notice. An experienced manuscript scholar can sometimes see these differences. The book can contain traces of multiple working lives. You continue copying. The person beside you turns a page. The parchment makes a soft sound. Then the quill begins again. The two rhythms are almost synchronized. Not deliberately, it simply happens. You both read, you both write, you both pause. The room becomes a collection of repeating movements. The shared work can make the scriptorium feel almost like a workshop. Not a workshop filled with loud tools. A quiet one. The tools are small. The motions are controlled. The finished objects are intellectual and religious as much as physical. But the labor remains labor. Someone has to do it. Someone has to sit there. Someone has to keep going. The person next to you may be younger. Perhaps they are still learning. Their writing may not yet have the same consistency. You can see occasional hesitation. A line takes longer. The quill stops. They look carefully at the exemplar. then continue. Learning a script requires time. The letters may be taught through repetition. A student watches, practices, copies examples, makes mistakes, corrects them. Gradually, the movements become more natural. Eventually, the hand becomes dependable enough for extended work. But this transition is not instantaneous. There is a period when the person has to think consciously about movements that an experienced scribe performs without noticing. You remember your own early attempts. Perhaps they were slower. Perhaps the letters were uneven. Perhaps the hand became tired more quickly. Practice changes that. Repetition turns awkward movements into familiar ones. The body learns. The eye learns. The page begins to look more consistent. This is how a craft survives, not simply because books contain instructions, because people teach other people. One generation passes habits to another, a method of holding the quill, a way of preparing the nib, a way of arranging the page, a way of checking the exemplar, a way of correcting mistakes. Much of this knowledge may never have been written down. It lived in demonstration. Watch me. Try it. Again. Not so much pressure. Move the hands slightly. Keep the lines steady. And again. The teaching itself is repetitive, like the work. You can imagine a quieter moment in the room. A senior scribe notices something. They approach another desk, look down, point gently to a line. The younger scribe watches. A correction is explained. The teacher returns to their own place. The lesson may have lasted less than a minute, but it can change the student's work for years. These small moments are almost impossible to recover. They rarely leave documentary evidence. We can see the handwriting. We can see the finished manuscript. We can sometimes identify different hands, but the conversations that shaped those hands are mostly gone. You continue writing. Perhaps someone nearby is learning from you now. You may not be aware of it. Your movements have become examples. The way you sharpen the quill, the way you position the parchment, the way you pause before difficult passages. Someone younger may watch, then imitate. The craft travels quietly. One hand teaches another. One working habit becomes another person's habit. This is part of why handwriting traditions can persist. A script is not only a visual system, it is also a physical practice. The letters have shapes, but those shapes are produced by movements. Movements can be taught, and once learned, they can be repeated thousands of times. You write another line. The scribe beside you does the same. For a moment, the two pages advance together. Then one person pauses. The other continues. There is no need for perfect synchronization. Each hand has its own rhythm. This becomes particularly interesting when several scribes work on the same large manuscript. The finished book may look unified, but beneath the unity are differences. Different hands, different speeds, different habits. Perhaps one scribe worked during the morning, another took over later. Perhaps different sections were assigned to different people. The division of labor could make a large project more manageable. Instead of one person copying an enormous text from beginning to end, the work could be distributed. This changes the nature of the task. The manuscript becomes a collective project. Your individual contribution is only one portion. You may never write the opening. You may never see the final page. Your responsibility is the section in front of you. That can be strangely comforting. You do not have to carry the entire book. You only have to carry your part. The same is true of the other workers. Together, the pages accumulate. A manuscript can therefore be understood as a kind of quiet assembly. Each person contributes something. The materials come together. The writing comes together. The pages are eventually gathered. The book becomes whole. And yet the people who created it may remain largely anonymous. This anonymity is especially striking when the manuscript survives. Centuries later, someone may admire the volume. They may know the author. They may know approximately where and when it was produced. They may identify the institution. But the names of the individual scribes may not survive. The hands survive. The people do not. You look down at your own writing. Your hand has already become part of the manuscript. Even if nobody records your name, the shape of your letters may remain. Your habits may remain. Your corrections may remain. Your small inconsistencies may remain. The page remembers what the historical record forgets. This is perhaps one of the most intimate qualities of manuscript culture. The physical trace of an unknown person can survive for centuries. A scribe whose name was never written anywhere may still be visible in every line. The hand is anonymous, but it is not absent. You continue. The person beside you shifts in their seat. The room remains cool. The fire gives off another small wave of warmth. Someone adds fuel. The flames rise. For a moment, the room brightens. Then the light settles. The pages look warm and pale. You continue writing. There may be other workers elsewhere in the building, someone preparing materials, someone working on decoration, someone handling completed gatherings, someone attending to other duties. The manuscript is part of a larger environment. You only see a small section of it. That is often how work feels. The whole system is larger than the person performing one task. You may not know where every material came from. You may not know who will eventually read the book. You may not know what will happen to it centuries later. You simply know what needs to happen now. The next line, then the next. This narrow focus makes the long work possible. You do not need to imagine the completed volume. You do not need to imagine its future readers. You only need to copy what is in front of you. Your colleague does the same. The room becomes quiet again. Quills move. Parchment turns, ink dries, the work continues. And perhaps this is one of the most important things to remember about medieval scribes. They were not simply lonely figures sitting in silence, producing beautiful books through mysterious patience. They were workers inside systems. They depended on materials. They learned from people. They taught others. They worked alongside colleagues. They made mistakes. They became tired. They stopped for meals and obligations. They adjusted their tools. They returned to the page. The beauty of the manuscript does not erase the ordinariness of the labor. If anything, the beauty can hide it. A finished page looks calm. The work behind it was made from countless practical actions. You look at the page again. The writing is neat. The lines are even. The section is almost complete. You hear another quill stop, then another. Perhaps the working period is ending. The room feels different when several people put down their tools. The silence becomes larger. You finish your line. Check it. There is no correction needed. You set the quill down. For a moment your hand rests. You look around. The other workers are doing the same. A few pages have been completed. A few more remain unfinished. The day is not ended because the book is finished. It is ended because the workers have reached the point where they can stop. Tomorrow the pages will still be there. The manuscript will wait. The tools will wait. The unfinished lines will wait. And when the work begins again, the same hands may return. Or perhaps another hand will take the quill. The book does not care who holds it. It only requires that someone continue. There is something unusual about copying a book that you did not write. The words belong to someone else. The ideas belong to someone else. The language may have been composed many years, decades, or centuries before your own hand ever touched the parchment. And yet, for hours at a time, you are the person who carries those words forward. You read them. You repeat them silently. You place them onto a new surface. The distinction between reading and writing becomes very thin. Your eyes move across the exemplar. Then your hand follows. A sentence passes through your attention. You may understand it, you may not. Perhaps the language is familiar. Perhaps some of it is difficult. Perhaps the text is religious. Perhaps it is philosophical. Perhaps it concerns law, medicine, history, grammar, or something more practical. The content can vary enormously. The physical task remains. You copy. There is no requirement that the scribe personally agrees with every sentence. There is no need to add an opinion. The job is transmission. The text must move from one copy to another. You are a link. That idea can make the work feel strangely quiet. You are not creating the story, you are preserving its path. The author may be absent. The future reader does not exist yet. Between them sits the manuscript, and between the manuscript's past and its future sits your hand. You look at the exemplar. The next sentence begins. You read. Then write. The words are familiar enough to follow. Your hand moves. There is a temptation when imagining medieval scribes to think of them as passive, as though the task were simply mechanical. Look at a letter. Make the same letter. Look at the next. Repeat. But the reality is more complicated. Reading itself requires interpretation. Medieval manuscripts often use abbreviations. Words may be compressed. Letters may be joined. Punctuation may differ from modern expectations. The scribe has to know how the writing system works. A symbol may stand for several letters. A familiar word may appear in a form that looks strange to modern eyes. The scribe's mind has to expand the abbreviated form and then reproduce the appropriate written form. This is one reason experience matters. A beginner can see marks. An experienced reader sees words. You look at the exemplar. A small abbreviation appears. You recognize it immediately. Your hand does not hesitate. You reproduce it. The process has become automatic. Another unfamiliar form appears. You pause. Look again. Perhaps you recognize it from context. Perhaps you compare it with another occurrence elsewhere on the page. Then you continue. The text is not simply being transferred visually. It is being understood enough to be transferred accurately. That does not mean every scribe was equally knowledgeable, nor does it mean every copy was perfect. But it does mean that copying could require genuine intellectual attention. You are reading while you write. That is tiring. The mind has to remain engaged. You cannot simply allow the hand to wander. If attention slips, the words can change. A phrase may be skipped. A repeated word may disappear. A similar line may be copied twice. The familiar problem returns. Mistakes. But now you understand more clearly why they happen. The work occupies several layers of attention at once. You must know where you are in the text. You must know what the letters mean. You must remember where the line begins and ends. You must control the hand. You must monitor the ink. You must remain aware of the page. And you must keep track of the relationship between the exemplar and the new copy. That is a great deal to maintain during a long day. You continue. The next sentence is easier. Your mind recognizes the structure. The hand moves smoothly. The work becomes almost meditative. This is where repetition can help. The more familiar the script becomes, the less conscious effort is required for each letter. The more familiar the text becomes, the easier it is to anticipate its structure. But anticipation has its own danger. You know what the sentence should say. The hand may write what you expect rather than what you actually see. This is another quiet source of error. The mind is helpful. Then, occasionally, it becomes too helpful. You look carefully. Do not rush. The word in front of you is not quite the word you expected. You copy what is actually there. The distinction is small, but it matters. A scribe is not supposed to improve the text simply because the scribe thinks another form would be better. Sometimes scribes did make changes. Sometimes they corrected apparent errors. Sometimes they introduced new ones. Texts could evolve as they were copied. But the ideal of accurate transmission remained important. You are handling something that came from elsewhere. The responsibility is not entirely yours. You have inherited the text. For a while you are its caretaker. You may never meet the person who composed it. You may never know who copied the exemplar before you. There may already be mistakes in the source. You may copy one without knowing it. This creates another layer of uncertainty. The manuscript before you is not necessarily the original. It is a copy of a copy. Perhaps several generations of copying separate you from the first version. Each generation could preserve. Each could alter. Each could correct. Each could introduce small differences. The text moves through human hands. and human hands are never perfectly transparent. You continue writing. The thought is almost invisible while you work. You are not thinking about centuries. You are thinking about the next line. Still, the larger reality is there. The words have survived because someone continued to copy them. You are part of that process. A sentence that might otherwise have disappeared can pass into another manuscript because you sat at this desk. The work is therefore repetitive, but it is not meaningless. Its importance lies partly in its accumulation. One line does not preserve a book. One page does not preserve a tradition. But thousands of lines, copied and recopied over generations, can carry a text forward. The scribe rarely sees the whole chain. You see only your portion. Perhaps that is one of the quietest forms of historical labor. You perform a task whose significance may be much larger than anything visible in the room. You do not know who will read the book later. You do not know whether it will survive. You do not know whether the manuscript will be damaged, lost, or forgotten. You simply continue. The page fills. The words move forward. Another paragraph. Another. Your hand becomes tired. You flex your fingers. The text remains. You look toward the exemplar. The next passage is longer. You settle back into the work. There may be sections you understand well. There may be sections that seem obscure. Perhaps you recognize a familiar religious phrase. Perhaps a quotation from another work appears. Perhaps a name is written in unfamiliar form. You do not stop to investigate every detail. That would change the nature of the work. Your responsibility is to reproduce the text, so you continue. Read. Remember. Write. Check. Continue. The words may become almost soundless inside your mind. You read them without speaking. The hand follows. The page receives them. The room remains quiet. This is where the scribe can almost disappear into the task. There is only the text, the movement, the page, the ink, the next line. You may lose awareness of your own body for a while. Then your shoulder reminds you. Your wrist reminds you. Your eyes remind you. You shift. The spell of concentration breaks briefly. You look around the room. Nothing much has changed. The same walls, the same desk, the same fire. Another scribe is still working. You return to your page. The text waits patiently. It has no awareness of your tiredness. It does not know that your fingers hurt. It does not know that the room is cold. It simply waits to be copied. You place the quill down, dip it into ink, return to the parchment. The sentence continues. So does your hand. There is also something quietly strange about the fact that the scribe may spend hours reproducing ideas without necessarily being the intended audience for them. A theological argument might be copied by someone who does not discuss theology. A legal text might pass through the hands of someone concerned mainly with accurate writing. A classical author may be reproduced by someone whose daily life is far removed from the ancient world described in the text. The manuscript connects different lives. The scribe's life, the author's life, the life of the future reader. They may never overlap. The page is where they meet. You write another sentence. Perhaps you recognize the rhythm of the language. Perhaps you do not. Either way, your hand continues. This can make the occupation feel almost anonymous in two directions. The scribe may disappear behind the author, and the author may disappear behind the text. What remains is the writing itself. A future reader may open the manuscript and think primarily about the ideas. The reader may never imagine the person who copied them. Yet the person is there. The slight variation in letter forms, the correction in the margin, the darker patch where the ink was heavier, the place where the quill hesitated, the tiny irregularity in spacing. The human being is hidden in the details. You continue. The next line is clean. The next one too. The text moves steadily across the page. The day grows quieter. Perhaps the work has become easier because you know the passage. Perhaps the familiarity allows your mind to settle. The repetition becomes almost rhythmic. A sentence begins. The hand follows. A sentence ends. The hand pauses, then begins again. There is no need for urgency. The manuscript will not disappear while you are writing. The text will remain where it is. You can take the time required to make the letters correctly. That slow pace may be one reason the finished page looks so deliberate. Every line has been given time. Every letter has occupied a physical moment. The page is the accumulation of those moments. You look at the completed section. It is no longer blank. The words have crossed from one surface to another. The author's text has become your handwriting. For a short while they are inseparable. Then you turn the page, and the process begins again. The old page is behind you. The new one waits. You look at the exemplar, find your place, hold the quill, and quietly continue carrying someone else's words into the future. The day does not end because the manuscript is finished. It ends because the light has gone, or because the working period has reached its natural stopping point, or because the body has simply done enough. You look toward the narrow window. There is very little daylight left now. The stone around it has become dark. The last pale light rests against the edge of the wall. On the desk, the parchment still appears brighter than everything around it. You can see the writing, but you have to look more carefully now. The fire is doing more of the work. Its light is uneven. It moves gently across the page. The letters seem to change as the flame moves. A dark line becomes brighter for a moment, then the parchment falls back into shadow. You know that this is probably a good time to stop. Not because the book is complete. It is nowhere near complete. There are still pages waiting, still sections to copy, still corrections to make, still work for tomorrow. But there comes a point when continuing becomes less sensible. The eyes are tired, the hand is tired, the light is poor. A mistake made late in the day may cost more time than stopping now. So you finish the line in front of you. You do not leave it halfway through. The final few letters are written carefully. Then you lift the quill. For a moment, the hand remains above the page. Then it lowers. The work is done for today. The manuscript is not. That distinction is important. You look at the completed section. There are perhaps several pages now. Some written today, some written earlier. The pages lie together in a growing stack. The book is slowly becoming itself. You may feel a small satisfaction, not excitement, just recognition. Something has been added. A few more pages exist because you spent the day here. You have made the manuscript slightly larger. Then you begin the quiet process of stopping. The tools have to be put away. The ink must be dealt with. The parchment must be protected. The unfinished work must remain safe. The desk needs to be left in a condition that allows the work to begin again. Tomorrow's scribe, perhaps you, should not have to reconstruct the entire workplace from nothing. You inspect the quill. Perhaps it is still usable. Perhaps it needs sharpening. You set it aside carefully. The knife is returned to its place. The ink vessel is moved somewhere secure. The manuscript is arranged. These actions are small, but the end of the working day is not simply standing up and walking away. The materials remain valuable. The pages are vulnerable. A spilled container could damage writing. A careless movement could crease parchment. A manuscript left exposed could be disturbed. So the closing routine matters. You make sure the pages are where they should be. The completed sections remain together. The unfinished section is clear. You may place something over the pages for protection. The exact methods vary according to the setting. But the principle is simple. The work must survive the night. You look at the manuscript one more time. The page that was blank earlier is now covered with writing. You remember how it looked before you began. Empty, pale, waiting. Now it contains hundreds, perhaps thousands of individual marks. Every letter required a movement. Every movement required a moment. The page is a record of time. You close or cover the manuscript. The writing disappears. For a moment the room seems emptier. The work is hidden. But it is not gone. Tomorrow, when the cover is removed, the same words will be there. That is one of the quiet powers of writing. The hand stops. The words remain. You rise from the desk. The body notices the change immediately. Your back straightens. Your shoulders move. Your legs feel stiff from sitting. For a moment, standing feels unfamiliar. You have been in one position for so long that the rest of the body seems to require reminding. You stretch, not dramatically, just enough. The neck turns, the shoulders roll slightly, the fingers open and close. The hands have spent hours holding the quill. Now they are empty. There is something almost strange about that emptiness. During the day, the quill was an extension of your hand. Now it rests on the desk. You walk away from it. The room looks different when you are no longer seated. You can see the other desks, the other pages, the remains of the day's work. Perhaps another scribe is still finishing a line. You hear the faint sound of a quill. Then another worker begins to put away their tools. The room gradually becomes still. One person leaves, then another. The fire remains. It continues burning after the writing has stopped. That is another small reminder that the room has its own life. The work may end. The fire continues. The stone remains cold. The manuscript remains on the desk. Outside, night continues to settle. You may leave the scriptorium and enter another part of the building. The transition is quiet. The sounds change. The writing room fades behind you. Your mind may still be carrying the rhythm of the letters. Read, write, check. Read, write, check. Even after the work stops, the pattern can remain for a while. Perhaps you find yourself thinking about a difficult passage, a correction, a letter that seemed uncertain, a section that went particularly smoothly. These small details stay in the mind, then gradually they disappear. The day has ended, and now the manuscript rests. This is where the enormous timescale of scribble work becomes easier to understand. One day is not enough. One scribe cannot create a great manuscript in an afternoon. Even a relatively modest book represents many hours of labor. Large manuscripts can involve much more, and when decoration, illustration, correction, binding, and other stages are included, the finished object may represent the combined work of many people over a considerable period. But no single evening feels like that. Tonight you only know that you wrote several pages. Tomorrow, perhaps several more. Then another day. Then another. The book grows almost imperceptibly. This is why patience is not simply a personality trait for the medieval scribe. It is built into the occupation. The work cannot be rushed indefinitely. A page requires a certain number of physical movements. Ink has to be placed. Letters have to be formed. Mistakes have to be avoided or corrected. Parchment has to be handled. The body has to endure the position. The book grows at the speed of the hand, and the hand has limits. You may return tomorrow with more energy, or less. You may feel rested, or you may carry yesterday's stiffness. The seasons may change, the temperature may change, the light may change, the manuscript remains. It waits for another portion of time. You might imagine the next morning, the same room, the same desk, the same covered pages, the same tools. The manuscript will be opened. The previous work will be checked. Then the next line will begin. There is something almost circular about it. The day begins. The manuscript opens. The quill touches parchment. The page fills. The light changes. The tools are put away. The manuscript closes. Night. Then again. Morning. Open. Write. Close. The book grows between these repetitions. This is the part that can be difficult to imagine from the finished object. A manuscript does not show you its waiting. It does not show you the moments when nobody was writing. It does not show you the night between two working days. It does not show you the quill being sharpened. It does not show you the scribe stretching tired fingers. It simply presents the completed page, but the completed page is only the visible surface of a much longer process. You leave the room. The firelight becomes distant. Perhaps you can still smell smoke on your clothing. Your fingers may still feel slightly stained from the day's work. There may be a trace of ink. The body carries small reminders, nothing dramatic, just evidence of a working day. The manuscript remains behind, For centuries that could be the fate of such work. A person completes a page, closes the book, leaves, the page remains, the person eventually disappears from the historical record. The manuscript does not. It may travel. It may be stored. It may be moved from one institution to another. It may survive changes of language, politics, ownership, and fashion. It may be forgotten for a time, then found again, and when someone eventually opens it, the first thing they see may be the writing, not the cold, not the tired fingers, not the dim light, not the long hours, only the letters. But the letters are evidence. They are the surviving traces of someone sitting where you have been sitting. Someone looked at a source. Someone dipped a quill. Someone began a line. Someone continued. Someone stopped for the night, and then, perhaps, returned the next day. That simple sequence is repeated across countless manuscripts. The scale is enormous, yet each individual act is small. One hand, one page, one day. The history of books is partly the history of these small acts. You might expect the important story to be about famous authors, famous libraries, great scholars, or beautiful illuminated pages. Those things matter, but underneath them is quieter labor. The labor of making the page exist, the labor of copying, the labor of checking, the labor of correcting, the labor of correcting, the labor of preparing materials, the labor of sitting still for a very long time. This is the forgotten work, not necessarily because it was literally forgotten by everyone, but because the finished book makes it easy to overlook. The manuscript looks finished. The labor has disappeared into it. Tonight you have spent time looking at that labor. You have followed the scribe from the preparation of materials through the slow repetition of writing. You have felt the cold of the room, the stiffness of the body, the changing light, the small fear of mistakes, the quiet presence of other workers, the strange responsibility of carrying words that were not your own. And now the day has reached its end. There is no dramatic conclusion. There is no final page. The book is still unfinished. Tomorrow will bring another blank section, another line, another sequence of letters. The work will begin again exactly where it stopped. That is perhaps the most fitting ending for a scribe's day, not completion, continuation. The manuscript remains open to the future. The page you finish tonight will become part of the pages written tomorrow. The correction you made will become invisible beneath the finished text. The tiredness will pass. The stiffness will ease. The ink will dry. And the letters will remain. For now, the scriptorium is quiet. The desks are still. The quills have been put away. The fire has settled into a lower glow. The parchment is covered. The room is dark. Outside, the night has taken the place of daylight. And somewhere inside that darkness, the work of the manuscript continues in a different way. Not through the hand, through waiting. The pages wait for morning. The text waits for the next line. The book waits for another day. And the scribe, having done enough for tonight, can finally leave it there. The room is quiet now. The writing has stopped. The quills have been put away. The ink has been covered, and the pages have been gathered carefully together. For tonight, there is nothing more to copy. The manuscript remains where it was left, a little larger than it was this morning, a little closer to completion, but still unfinished. And perhaps that is the most appropriate place to leave the medieval scribe, not beside a grand finished book, not beneath a triumphant final page, but beside an unfinished manuscript waiting for another morning. Because the real work of the scribe was rarely dramatic. It was made from repetition, from attention, from materials that had to be prepared and maintained, from cold fingers and tired shoulders, from changing daylight, from small mistakes, from corrections that had to be made quietly, from words that belonged to other people but had to pass through one person's hands if they were to survive. You have spent these hours following that process slowly, and perhaps now the finished manuscript looks a little different. It is easy to look at an old book and see only the beauty, the neat rows of letters, the carefully arranged margins, the occasional painted decoration, the darkened pages, the strong binding, the sense that the object has always been complete. But it was never born complete. It began as separate materials, a hide, a feather, a small quantity of ink, wood, thread, metal. Each had to be prepared. Each had to be brought into the right place. Then someone had to sit down. Someone had to begin. One letter, then another, a word, a line, a page. And after enough pages, something that had not existed before began to take shape. That process could take a long time, longer than the finished object suggests. A modern book can be reproduced quickly. A digital text can be copied almost instantly. A document can be duplicated without the reader even noticing that a copy has been made. The medieval scribe lived in a world where copying had a physical cost. To duplicate a book meant making another physical book. The words had to travel through a hand. The page had to receive them. The ink had to dry. The parchment had to be handled. The pages had to be gathered. The book had to be preserved. Nothing was instantaneous. That slowness shaped the culture of books. A text could be valuable partly because reproducing it required so much labor. A manuscript was not simply information. It was accumulated human time. You can almost imagine that time still resting inside the pages, not literally, but in the sense that every line represents an interval in which someone was sitting there, paying attention. The page is quiet, but it is full of time. That may be one of the reasons old manuscripts can feel strangely intimate. You are looking at marks made by a hand that has been gone for centuries. The person may have had an ordinary day. Perhaps they were tired. Perhaps the room was cold. Perhaps they were thinking about something unrelated to the manuscript. Perhaps they were hungry. Perhaps they were looking forward to stopping. Perhaps they simply wanted to finish the page before leaving. We do not know. History often preserves the object and loses the ordinary person who made it. The manuscript survives. The scribe becomes anonymous. But anonymity does not mean absence. The hand remains. You can still see the movement. The letters may be carefully formed. Perhaps one line is slightly darker. Perhaps one word is cramped. Perhaps a correction sits in the margin. Perhaps a small variation appears halfway through the book. These are tiny signs, but they remind us that the page was made by a person, not by an abstract process, not by a machine, not by an invisible hand. A person, someone who had to sit down and continue. There is something quietly humbling about that. The great texts of the medieval world could survive because ordinary acts were repeated patiently. A person copied one page, another copied another. Someone checked the work. Someone corrected it. Someone eventually bound the pages. A later reader opened the book. Then perhaps another person copied that copy. And another. Generation after generation, words move through time. The scribe could not see the future. You cannot imagine that the person sitting in a dim room centuries ago knew which manuscripts would survive. They did not know which pages would be preserved. They did not know which books would eventually become famous. They did not know that scholars many centuries later might examine the shapes of their letters. They were simply doing the work in front of them. That may be the quietest lesson in all of this. The importance of an action is not always visible while the action is being performed. A page may seem ordinary when it is written. A manuscript may seem like one more assignment. A day's work may feel like nothing more than another day. But time can give ordinary work an unexpected weight. The page survives, the person does not. And yet something of the person remains. You might think of the scribe now, leaving the desk at the end of the evening. The room is dark. The manuscript has been covered. The hands are empty. The body is tired. Tomorrow there will be more. But tonight there is nothing more to do. The person walks away. The page remains. The ink dries. The fire burns lower. And the room waits. Perhaps centuries pass. The building changes. The people change. The language changes. The book moves from one place to another. The scribe's name is forgotten. But eventually someone opens the manuscript again. A reader sees the same letters. Perhaps that reader knows nothing about the person who made them. Still, the connection exists. The reader is looking at something the scribe once looked at too. The same sequence of marks, the same words, separated by centuries, the two people meet through the page. There is no conversation, no voice, only writing. And perhaps that is enough. The scribe's work was never only about producing beautiful pages. It was about keeping a chain intact. One text could pass from an older manuscript into a newer one. A book could be carried somewhere else. A reader could encounter words that might otherwise have disappeared. The scribe was one small link, but without the links there would be no chain. Without the repeated work there would be gaps. And so the quiet hours mattered. The cold mattered. The tired hands mattered. The carefully prepared quill mattered. The correction in the margin mattered. Even the mistakes mattered, because they remind us that the process was human. You can let that thought settle now. There is no need to hurry toward a conclusion. The work is already finished for tonight. The manuscript is resting. The room is resting. And perhaps you can imagine the difference between that world and the one around you. You live in a world where words can travel almost without physical effort. A sentence can cross an ocean in less than a second. A book can be copied millions of times without another human hand reproducing every letter. Light can remain available long after the sun has disappeared. Warmth can be summoned almost instantly. A page can be enlarged. A mistake can be erased. A document can be duplicated. The physical burden of preserving words has become almost invisible. And that is useful. It is convenient. It is one of the quiet miracles of modern life. But it can also make it difficult to imagine what writing once required. The medieval scribe had to live inside the process. The page could not be separated from the body. The material could not be separated from the work. Time could not be removed from copying. Every word cost something. Not necessarily money, time, attention, posture, ink, parchment, light, patience. The finished manuscript carries all of those costs quietly. Perhaps that is why it is worth remembering the people behind the books. Not because they were all extraordinary. They probably were not. Many were simply workers. People doing a task that needed to be done. People who became skilled because they repeated the same movements again and again. People who might have preferred to be somewhere warmer. People whose fingers sometimes hurt. People who made mistakes. People who corrected them. People who stopped when the light became too poor. People who returned the next day. That is enough. You do not need to turn them into heroes. The work itself is interesting. Its quietness is enough. The scribe sits, the quill moves, the page fills, time passes, and eventually the work enters history. Tonight, perhaps, you have also become aware of how much modern comfort hides. A light that remains steady, a chair designed around the body, warm air, instant communication, endless copies, the ability to stop writing without losing your place, the ability to correct a sentence without damaging the surface beneath it. These things are so ordinary that they barely seem like comforts. But once you imagine their absence, they become visible. The medieval scribe had fewer such conveniences, and still books were made. Page after page, day after day. The human hand was slow, but it was persistent. That persistence is what remains. So now, let the room grow quiet again. The manuscript is closed. The fire is low. The last useful light has disappeared from the window. The desk is empty. The tools are waiting for morning. There is no need to imagine the next day's work in detail. It will be much like this one. The cover will open. The page will be found. The quill will be prepared. The ink will be stirred or uncovered. The first line will begin, and then another. The book will grow slowly, as it always has, one page, one hand, one quiet hour at a time. And somewhere inside that simple repetition is the reason so many words have reached us at all. Not because the people who preserved them were surrounded by comfort, Not because every page was produced perfectly, not because the work was fast, but because someone kept going. Someone looked at the next line and copied it, then the next. And then, when the day was done, someone put the quill down and returned the following day. That is the forgotten work, quiet enough to disappear, patient enough to survive. The room is still now. The parchment is covered. The ink is covered. The ink is dry. The hand has stopped, and the words remain. You can let them remain there. There is nothing else required tonight. The scribe has left the desk. The manuscript can wait. The fire can settle into darkness, and the long chain of writing can rest for a few hours before beginning again. Perhaps somewhere in that quiet you can imagine the old page waiting patiently beneath its cover, not asking anything, not demanding anything, simply remaining as the centuries pass around it, as voices come and go, as rooms change, as hands disappear. The page remains. And for tonight, that is where we can leave it, with the work finished for one evening, but never truly finished, with one more manuscript resting quietly in the dark, and with the memory of the person who once sat beside it, slowly carrying someone else's words forward, one careful line at a time.